All right. That's because both of them have same powers, Pankaj. That's because it also has substantive proposals, whereas money bills only have allocation of financial resources. And if it is something new, it is a matter of policy, it's a matter of new law which may require the assent of both the houses as it would have an application on the entire country. Okay. We're going to start with parliamentary committees right now, immediately. We'll first do a broad understanding and then we'll deep dive into parliamentary committees in the mains analysis as to how and why is it important, to what degree is it important, right? Now, we're going to look into parliamentary committees. That's because both of them have same powers, Pankaj. That's because it also has substantive. Sorry, just checking the sound, because we were facing some Airtel connectivity issues today, but thankfully it is okay so far. Now, when we study parliamentary committees at the moment, we will see that rule number 3 and rule number 4 will heavily be in application. And we also understand that the strength of the Lok Sabha is twice that of the Rajya Sabha on an approximate basis. So let's start with parliamentary committees and figure out exactly how this works, right? Now, when we look at parliamentary committees in general as a whole, we understand that there are two kinds of parliamentary committees. The first is temporary committees. These temporary committees, as we would know, these temporary committees are also called ad hoc committees. Ad hoc again is another word which means temporary. For example, you would have often heard of ad hoc appointments or ad hoc posts and so on and so forth, right? Now, as far as temporary ad hoc committees are concerned, there are essentially of two kinds. They are set up for two reasons. Either they're set up to discuss a specific issue, or they are set up to discuss a specific bill, right? Now, if they're discussed, if they're for a specific issue or a specific bill, there are two kinds of composition. Either they'll have members from one house only, or they'll have members of both the houses. If they have members only from one house, it's called a select committee. If it has members from both the houses, it is called a joint committee, right? It is called a joint committee, right? Now, all right. When we say the word temporary, let's understand this as clearly and as confidently as we can. Temporary means the entire committee as a concept is dissolved or is abolished after the purpose is over. Kaam khatam, aadmi khatam, kaam khatam, committee khatam. So that is why they're called temporary or they're called ad hoc committees, right? They're only there for a specific purpose, all right? And then you have standing committees, or you have permanent committees. Now, when we say permanent committees, what does the word permanent mean? That yes, Ankit, yes. Now, when we say permanent committees, what is the word permanent supposed to mean? The word permanent has a very simple origin. It means that the members of the committee will change on a yearly basis, or in some rare cases every 2 years, but usually on a yearly basis. Okay, the committee is there, the members keep changing on a yearly basis. That is why they're called permanent committees. It does not mean that the members are permanently a part of these committees, because these members at the end of the day are MPs, and MPs are not permanent. They keep changing over a course of time depending on it. Okay. Now, Ravina, tribunals will take, it's about 5 o'clock. So I think 5 to 6, 6:37, right? Now, so standing committees and permanent committees. Now, there are two kinds of standing committees or permanent committees. First are a set of committees which are attached to a ministry. They're advising the ministry with certain functions. They're supposed to assist them in policies, in certain bills, pick up certain issues. So these are called departmental committees. These are departmental standing committees because ministries are further divided into departments. And you also have parliamentary standing committees, right? These are committees which are functioning in association with the parliament. So they're parliamentary standing committees. Departmental committees are functioning to assist or to review the elected executive, and parliamentary committees exist to assist the legislatures in, better scrutiny and better review of the work, right? So that's the fundamental difference. Now, departmental committees also, by the way, can do a similar discussion on a bill. It's entirely up to the House. The House gets to decide, the Speaker gets to decide whether a bill has to be referred to a departmental committee, or do you need to make a separate committee for a separate specific bill. Now, these departmental committees are attached to ministries. You have some committees will handle 2-3 ministries also at the same time, because you have a large number of ministries in the country. Okay. Now there are about 21 members of the Lok Sabha and about 10 members of the Rajya Sabha on average. And if you see, this is twice the strength of the Rajya Sabha, and this is also a way of checks and balances, also a hollow candy that we give to the Rajya Sabha, because they usually don't get to assist in the formulation. They don't get equal powers with respect to money bills, the budget, and so on and so forth. Okay. Now, as far as parliamentary committees are concerned, there are essentially the following formats. Either you have a separate committee for the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha, or you have a combined committee for the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha, which means members of both Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha, and you have a committee only for Lok Sabha. There is no committee which only exists in the Rajya Sabha but doesn't exist in the Lok Sabha. That's also another form of center stronger than the states. So either you'll have a committee, one committee for Lok Sabha, similar committee for Rajya Sabha members, either a committee comprising of both the members, or only a committee comprising of Lok Sabha members. Now, depending on the rules their functions are allocated, you have separate committees for rule number 3, which is intra-separation of powers. Then you have a combined committee where you want to keep a check and balance. So you have rule number 4, very similar to that, checks and balances. And you have committees only comprising of the Lok Sabha members. This is rule number 2, which is center stronger than the states. So it's very easy for you to then know on the basis of function their composition, right? Like, for example, if I have to tell you that there is a committee which is advising the ministries on the kind of budgetary estimates they should have, the kind of demand for grants they should formalize. They may assist the ministry at the back end, or they may assist in all of those things. Then it is essentially performing a function of deciding how much money should be spent. And if this is a function about deciding how much money should be spent, then the Rajya Sabha should also not be involved indirectly in the process. So that is why a committee like that, which is called the Estimates Committee, right, will only have members of the Lok Sabha, will only be a committee as an extension to the Lok Sabha. In addition to this, you will often see, for example, the concepts of political majority. So in the Rajya Sabha, there is no concept of a political majority. So whether a bill is to be introduced by a government member or a private member, the bill should equally be given importance because there is no concept of a political majority. But in the case of the Lok Sabha, there is a concept of a political majority. That is how the government is to be formed, which is why often private member bills may be neglected, which is why you may require a dedicated committee in the Lok Sabha to make sure that private member bills, the good ones, are taken up for consideration, are taken up for review, and certainly must be given due attention if needed. So a private member bill committee will often exist only with members of the Lok Sabha, right? Now, suppose the Estimates Committee is helping the government decide how much money has to be spent. But then once the government has spent the money, then it should be looked into whether they spent the money properly or not. Then it should be looked into whether the money was spent for the right reasons or not, or for the wrong reasons or not, right? And for that reason, you must have a check and balance, because then ultimately the accountability of the government is to the parliament, checks and balances. So that is why you can have what is called a public accounts committee, which sees how the money has been spent. And the Public Accounts Committee will work on some technical expertise. If the Election Commission of India can advise the President on electoral disqualifications because they are your dedicated agency, in the same way, we have a dedicated constitutional auditor in the country, and that agency is called the Comptroller and the Auditor General. So the Public Accounts Committee will work on the basis of the CAG reports which are sent to the committee, examine the CAG reports and cause for some of the CAG reports to be laid before the parliament, right? And then of course, you will see separate committees for Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha, wherein the work is about that specific house. Like for example, committees on business advisory or assurances, right? Now these are committees which are for that specific house. How the business in that specific house has to be conducted, has to be run. So then you should have a separate committee for those houses. So you have separate committees. But committee for SC, ST and women, now that is something which is constitutionally guaranteed. So you can have a combined committee for SC, ST, Women Welfare Committee, right? Let's say library committee. There is one library for the entire parliament. So combined committee of both the houses for that library, right? So it's a very logical way to go about it, and there's a very logical way to look into it. Okay, all right. Now, simple enough, clear enough, categorical enough. Now, we will of course get into the details of it, but let me show you some of these committees live so that you understand how they actually exist in real time. Okay. See. These are your departmentally standing committees. Some of these committees are with multiple ministries such as, say, education, women, children, youth and sports, labor, textile, skill development. These are separate ministries, but they have one committee attached to all of these ministries, right? Similarly, science and technology, environment and forests, then transport, tourism and culture. So you will often see severally that the same committee may have multiple ministerial setups. Now, in some cases, the chairperson may be from the ruling party. In some cases, maybe from the opposition party. Chairperson may be Lok Sabha, Rajya Sabha. That's okay. Like for agriculture, animal husbandry and food processing, PC Gadwadar, who's from Bagalkot, is your Lok Sabha MP and the chairperson. Similarly, when I see DMK MP Kanimozi, who's been in the news for the wrong reasons for quite some time, who was a MP from Thoothukudi, is an MP of the Lok Sabha and is the chairperson of Chemicals and Fertilizers. Similarly, you'll see here BJP Lok Sabha. Right here you will see Rashtriya YSR Congress Party, the South Indian party that we often know as. So the Vijay Sai Reddy Rajya Sabha MP is the chairperson here. So there will be several committees, right? Like for example, let us say we are looking at health and family welfare. Okay, Ram Gopal Yadav, Samajwadi Party MP from Rajya Sabha, is the chairperson of the committee. Abhishek, just hold on. No, chairperson can't be. Don't quote me factual stuff which I will anyways give you and try to question whether I know this or not. Of course, the chairperson of the house will not be a member of the committee, right? Okay, now see. Ram Gopal Yadav here, for example, is the chairperson of the Health Committee on Health and Family Welfare. Now see the kind of work that they're doing. See, they are largely looking at the following things: vaccine development, implementation of Ayushman Bharat, mental health, medical devices, affordability of cancer treatment, and they're also looking at the Ayush Ministry, which is Ayurveda, Yoga, Unani, Siddhi and Homeopathy, wherein they're looking at, the challenges of Ayurveda medicine and of course the review of the National Ayush Mission. Let us see how and when have they met. The last time they have met is on 22nd, this is 9th, 12th, 9th December. This should be January, anyways, because yes, so this should be, how is this 22nd February? Anyways, so they've got the dates wrong here. No, this is slightly date wrong here. So anyways, they've met very recently on taking the statements of the secretaries, calling the secretaries and asking, yes, no. So calling the secretaries, asking for them to give their explanations on how Ayush Ministry is going. They often also give you reports. So if their reports are slightly complicated and sometimes maybe a little odd. For example, the outbreak of COVID-19 and its management. This is actually the standing committee report summary, which was chaired, and this is where they've actually given proper setups and explanations that the committee recommended healthcare spending should be this much, health infrastructure mein problem tha, the committee noted poor contact tracing and less testing is a reason why COVID has increased. So they keep on doing these kind of works. So the basic explanation here is that these committees are actually functional committees. Are they doing the best to their capability? Well, that is of course a problem. And of course, you have certain ad hoc committees. These ad hoc committees are set up for a specific, for example, right now there's a joint committee for the Personal Data Protection Bill. The bill which has been going on forever. Right now, this committee has been meeting for quite some time. The last time they met was on the 22nd of November 2021, where they're looking at the draft report of the Joint Committee on Personal Data Protection. Once the Data Protection Bill is passed, yes, they're supposed to, yes. So, So, they're supposed to, in this case, once the data protection bill is done, is over with, the committee will automatically lapse, right? Okay, understood. Usually BIPIN, they do not announce an agenda beforehand, largely because a lot of times there are changes in the schedule. So either it might be a technical error or they are supposed to meet. Let us see what the case might be. And here you will see reports. They've not updated the reports here, but this is how it works. Now, there are of course certain state schedules, like for example, how Bipin is saying, the standing committees are sometimes scheduled to meet on the following days, especially around the parliament being in session. So you'll of course find certain issues that have to be discussed. Right? As I was telling you about the ministries which are financial in nature, public accounts, undertakings and estimates. So public undertakings is a committee, again, reviewing how much money the public undertakings are spending and are they spending in the right way or not. In such a scenario, this is again going to comprise of members of both the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha. So, for example, the Public Accounts Committee, which is often known as the most well-known committee, it's chaired by a Congress MP from Behrampur. And if you see the kind of work that they do, you will always see them working on CAG reports. Right? So performance audit of crop insurance on CAG, similarly CAG report of 2018, again CAG report of 2017 on parking of funds with respect to loss of interest. Similarly, they look at core insurance solution systems in Department of Posts, what the CAG had recommended back in 2018. Okay, we'll come to how they're chosen, don't worry about it. They're chosen internally, we'll come to that. Okay, but this is largely how all of this is done. These are your larger committees. ठीक है, ये दो चीज़ें कैसे चूज करते हैं पढ़ सकते हो, मैं भी आपको मेंस के उसमें दिखा रहा हूँ, इन चीज़ों में अपना दिमाग मत लगाओ. ठीक है. Now, once we understand the broad basics of it, now we should look at the analysis of it, right? Now, when we look at the analysis of it, we should now spend some time on how parliamentary committees actually exist, है ना? चलिए. Now we'll get into the technical details. There are questions from here in the pre and the mains also. चलिए. हाँ नितिन. Correct. चलिए. So what are your parliamentary committees? Now, parliamentary committees are those which usually scrutinize legislative bills or legislative proposals in two ways. First, by discussing it, the parliament scrutinizes it by either discussing it on the floor of the house or usually referring it to a parliamentary committee. So, a parliamentary committee is a committee, ladies and gentlemen, your answers, is appointed or elected by the house or nominated by the speaker or the chairperson, works under the direction of the speaker or the chairperson, presents its report to the house or to the speaker or the chairperson, and has a secretariat provided by the Lok Sabha or the Rajya Sabha to give them all the administrative, clerical, stenographical and other forms of support. Because this is so diverse, you will never see a question in the prelims exam as to how are the precedents or how are the members chosen, because this is very diverse and these are dependent on the house rules, which are technically not in your syllabus, for which you do not have to spend a lot of time getting into details of, right? So let's understand parliamentary committees exist because they are additions to parliamentary businesses. Okay, now what are your constitutional provisions? See, in independent India, the first Public Accounts Committee was set up in 1950, and they usually have their authority from two places. First, Article 105 on the privilege of the parliamentary members. Now, privilege means if I have the right to say what I want to, speak how I want to, vote how I want to, sometimes anti-defection law curtails my right to speak how I want to, vote how I want to. So therefore, when parliamentary committees are designed, and these are essentially done outside the formal sitting of the parliament, and anti-defection law does not apply to parliamentary committee proceedings, where people can really speak out their mind, can really say what they want to, and they're not under a constant threat that if I say something which is against the official decision or the official verdict of my party, or if I say something which goes against my official position of the party, then I may also be disqualified under anti-defection law. Or it also helps you sort of reinstill and re-strengthen your basic tenets of inter-party democracy. It enhances the role of a constructive opposition, and you're away from the nation's eye, and you can truly say what you want to on what an issue that you may have, right? And under Article 118, it is also the Parliament's authority to make rules regulating its procedure and conduct of business, which is why you have your own parliamentary rules. I'll show you your parliamentary rules in just a minute so that you understand why are they not in your syllabus, because they're actually extremely complex. I mean, they're very procedural, but they're extremely complex, right? See, for example, this is the rules and procedures of conduct of business in the Lok Sabha. Right now, this is the 15th edition of the Lok Sabha Secretariat. Just see the technical details of it. This is a 2014 version. What I usually refer to is a book that it's not for you as UPSC aspirants, but जब मुझसे कई बार कोई पूछते हैं, so Practice and Procedure of Parliament in India, Anup Mishra, it's a 17th edition, it's a 2021 edition. Please गलती से भी ये किताब मत खरीदना, because ये बहुत ज़्यादा टेक्निकल डिटेल में है. ये हम जैसे लोगों के लिए जिसके पास ज़िंदगी में कुछ करने को नहीं है तो हम पढ़ते हैं. जैसे फॉर एग्जाम्पल in your Lakshmikant, your calling attention motion is one paragraph. It's anyways not relevant for your exam. For us, when we read calling attention to matters of urgent importance, it starts from here, gets into conditions of admissibility. There are several rules and sub-rules that are mentioned here, and it goes up all the way for another 15 to 16 pages. तो मैं चाहूँ तो आपको ये किताब निकाल के पढ़ा दूँ, मेरे घंटे काउंट हो जाएंगे, but it's not relevant for you, so don't worry about it. I read it because sometimes there are technical issues in the newspaper which are not very clearly mentioned. कुछ चीज़ें होती हैं, so we often need to refer to certain things. ठीक है, so आप रहने दीजिएगा, वो मेरा प्रॉब्लम है, वो मैं देख लूँगा. ठीक है, okay, right. Now, so every house has its own set of rules, both for the Lok Sabha and for the Rajya Sabha. They have their own set of rules. Like for example, if you have Lok Sabha rules, you also have तो पॉइंट ऑफ ऑर्डर क्या होता है, पॉइंट ऑफ इंक्वायरी क्या होता है, ये सब है, ये देख लो. ठीक है, ये रूल्स बनते हैं इससे. ओके, अब जैसे एक रैंडम सा, तुमको कोई भी एक रैंडम सा पेज दिखाता हूँ. बाय द वे, दीज आर वेरी एक्सपेंसिव. आई मीन ये ऐसे छोटे छोटे किताब मिल जाती है, बट व्हेन यू गेट अ फुल कमेंट्री. अब जैसे तुमको चुकाता हूँ, छोटा सा एक रैंडम सा पेज खोलते हैं. ठीक है, ओके, लेट्स स्टॉप. Rule 92, Printing and Publication of Reports. The Secretary General shall cause every report of a select committee to be printed, and a copy of the report shall be made for the use of every member of the council, which is the Rajya Sabha. The report and the bill as reported by the select committee shall be published in the Gazette, and then of course you have the procedure after that bill. तो ये बहुत टेक्निकल चीज़ें हैं, बहुत अननेसेसरी कॉम्प्लिकेटेड है, ऐसे होता ही है. ठीक है, अब अलग अलग कमेटी में कैसे होगा, जैसे कोरम क्या है, हाउस कमेटी क्या है, डिफरेंट कमिटीज़ विल हैव डिफरेंट compositions also. ये देखो सारी चीज़ें यहाँ पे दे रखी है, ठीक है. This is how it is. All right, understood? ये आप लोग छोड़ दो, ये हम बुड्ढों के लिए, ये हमारा काम है, ठीक है. All right. हाँ, मतलब that one topic has one full book on it, which is what I keep telling people. Read what is relevant, not what is available, right? चलिए, like कई बार क्या होता है, कुछ प्रोसीजर हो जाता है, there's something which has happened, जैसे कोई फ्लो टेस्ट हो गया, right? हाँ, यस पंकज, एब्सोल्युटली. अब जैसे फॉर एग्जांपल कोई फ्लो टेस्ट हो गया, कोई कंपोजिट फ्लो टेस्ट हो गया, या कुछ नो कॉन्फिडेंस का इशू हो गया. अब व्हाट इज द एग्जैक्ट रूल अंडर विच इट वाज एडमिटेड, वो हम लोगों के लिए है दैट वी रेफर इट टू द बुक एंड देन वी कैन टेल यू इन अ सिंप्लीफाइड फॉर्म कि ऐसा होता है, दिस इज हाउ इट इज, दिस इज नाउ इट, दिस इज नॉट हाउ इट इज. एनीवेज, सो जो मैं आपको बता रहा था, आई ऑलरेडी पुट इट ऑन अ टेबल फॉर यू हियर. आप इसको रिवाइज कर सकते हैं एंड यू कैन ऑलवेज मेक दिस टेबल इन द मेंस एग्जाम for a 12.5 marker, so that you're able to answer things in a more comprehensive manner. Okay, now as I was telling you, based on the nature of functions, you have the following committees. Then on the basis of composition, you have the different sorts of committees. How we had studied classifications of bills on content, on procedure, on introduction. Similarly, committees also can be on the basis of function, on the basis of composition, and so on and so forth. अब मैं देख के बता सकता हूँ कि जैसे petitions और privileges की कमेटी है, वो हर एक हाउस की अपनी अपनी होगी, ethics की अपनी अपनी होगी, government assurances, subordinate legislation, papers laid on a table अपनी अपनी होगी, right? समझ. और यहाँ जब लिखा ही है नाम के आगे जॉइंट कमेटी, तो बोथ हाउसेज विल बी अ पार्ट ऑफ इट. बिजनेस एडवाइजरी अपनी अपनी होगी. कमिटी ऑन प्राइवेट मेंबर बिल्स राज्यसभा में जरूरत नहीं है, लोकसभा में है तो लोकसभा की ही होगी, राइट? हाउस कमेटी अलग अलग होगी, ठीक है. लाइब्रेरी कमेटी जॉइंट होगी, बिकॉज एमपी एंड एमएलए सैलरीज आर गवर्न्ड कलेक्टिवली. एमपी salaries of Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha are governed collectively. Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha MPs do not have different salaries, so you'll have a joint committee for it. ठीक है, बस लॉजिक लगाना है तो याद करने की जरूरत नहीं पड़ेगी, right? Now, why are they required? See, parliamentary committees are required for the following reasons. And just look at it and just listen to what I'm saying and allow my voice to sort of explain what is happening on the board for you. See, the first point and a rather more important point is parliamentary committees focus on remedying the legislative infirmity of the debate, of the quality of debate. ये बहुत important point है, मैं यहाँ circle कर देता हूँ and I'll come back to this. Second, of course, is accountability. Third is your additional advantages such as efficiency and expertise. Then you have how can the process or the procedure through which you can reach a committee. The first thing you must understand is that our parliament might sound like a grand institution, might sound like an organization. I've already explained, Avnish, why. The parliament sounds like a grand institution, and in fact it indeed is a grand institution. There are no two doubts about it. But here's the thing, when you actually sit down with the numbers, when you actually sit down with how much of this has been relevant, how many times has the parliament actually sat down and done productive work in the day, when you remove the questions which are political in nature, when you remove the adjournments, when you remove almost everything else, what are the basic, how has the parliament really done its job, and how successful has the parliament been in really doing its job? You will then understand how terrible our qualitative and quantitative statistics are. I'll give you parliamentary data towards the end of it, but you will understand through a larger perspective that the parliament does not even meet for 100 days in a year. And actually for the last few years, it has been meeting for less than 70 days. And in those 70 days, they only spend half the day usually on the discussions of the bill. And even those discussions per se are very political in nature. They are not technically sound as they should be, which is why you require an institutional setup to truly, give essence and meaning to the job of the parliament. Second is, because the Lok Sabha has become a formality house. It really has, with with anti-defection law across both the houses, with the government having brute majority in the Lok Sabha. The Lok Sabha largely has become a house which is just passing bills for the sake of it, or not passing it for the lack of a sake of it. So the real understanding, the real analysis, taking in proper experts, understanding the pulse of the country, these very important gestures, these very important discussions can only happen in a forum which is external to the core institution of the parliament, but within the larger structure of the parliament. Which is why you will require parliamentary committees. Apart from this, because parliamentary committees are working on a set agenda, they're supposed to meet on a specific date, they're supposed to do a specific number of jobs, they're supposed to look into a specific amount of evidences, discussions, call a specific set of people, and of course publish the outcomes of those meetings, or what is the general conclusion that has come out. It is no doubt a more efficient and a more transparent setup. And second, it's never just the MPs. These parliamentary committees can also invite technology experts, agricultural experts, field experts, lawyers, academicians, professors, secretaries, civil servants, whoever they want to make sure that they get the best possible input on deciding whether, a law should be made or not. Over and above this will also make sure that the opposition does not feel that my only job, right? In this class, in the offline, because I've updated the notes. No, the last time this happened for you guys was a long while ago, right? I don't know, Bhavna, if you mean this in a good way or a bad way. I don't know if you're liking this better or not, because I've added a lot more data, I've added a lot more information. All of this is already there with you in your drive. The updated notes are already there. So I don't know if that's a good thing or not. Anyways, so above this and beyond this, there is of course a reason as to why you will be able to make sure that the opposition is involved, is also feeling not just as a negative factor. Because if you think about it, when the BJP is in opposition, they will have all the problems that they don't currently have, because they're the government. On the same issue, the opposition's job is never to just oppose. It's to constructively participate in the discussions which are in the best interest of the House. And then of course, this also ensures that, because anti-defection laws, privileges, none of this is really applicable. You're in your own private space, so to speak, as a public office. You can really get into the nitty-gritties of it. You can really get into the discussions of it, and of course, get to the best possible outcome. And as far as the purposes of parliamentary committees are concerned, there are essentially three ways in which you can reach a parliamentary committee. First is the minister himself, herself, or themselves can ask for the recommendation to a committee. The second is either the presiding officer can decide. And the third is that after the bill has been passed by one house, the second house would want to look at it first by referring it to a parliamentary committee. In fact, this is often quite contested. Like, for example, with the farm laws, people expected that the farm laws would be referred to a parliamentary committee, as there was no clear urgency for the implementation of the farm laws. So that becomes an important part of it all. And above and beyond this, a committee's report is recommendatory. And always remember this, because what is more important than implied democratic mandate is direct democratic mandate. There's the only way something becomes a law permanently or in its absolute fruition is when both the houses have voted on the floor of the house. Parliamentary committees are not backdoors to the passages of the law, right? Parliamentary committees are not backdoors to the passages of the law. And because they are not backdoors to the passages of the law, what ends up happening in this scenario is that you are just providing expertise and your recommendations are just going to be non-binding. And if the parliament wants, they can take up your committee report. Like for example, when the Committee on Labour had recommended changes to the labor codes which were pending on the floor of the parliament accepted, I think, more than 80-90% of the recommendations. In fact, when the Committee for the National Medical Commission had recommended for the whole removal of bridge courses for Ayush doctors, right? Of course, this has of course been accepted in a far greater detail by the parliament, right? Of course. So this is why it is the case. Yeah. Beta, why do you think I merged the batches from yesterday? Because I've added a lot more information, a lot more data, so that you could have a better understanding of things. Na? That is why. अब मैं 1 साल पुराने नोट्स तो नहीं चिपकाऊंगा ना, उसको अपडेट करूंगा, उसको डेटा मैं हमेशा ऐड करता रहूंगा. दैट इज वाई बेटा, दैट इज वाई भावना, है ना. मतलब वो मेरे से नहीं होता कि एक चीज बना ली अब पूरे 2-3 साल वही चिपका रहे हो, वो नहीं होगा मेरे से. ठीक है. नाउ लेट्स लुक एट सम वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट एंड वेरी वेरी क्रूशियल डेटा पॉइंट्स. सी, व्हेन वी लुक एट सम डेटा पॉइंट्स दैट यू कैन यूज इन योर एग्जाम, यू कैन ऑफ कोर्स sort of suppress them into 2 or 3 lines, or you can always extend them on the issue that has been asked in the mains exam. As I was telling you, on an average, the parliament has met for less than 70 days a year, and this is an incredibly short amount of time for the parliament to get into the appropriate amount of depth which is needed for the right amount of understanding of a certain bill or a certain issue. Okay, of a bill or a certain issue, right? Now, second is the parliament undoubtedly deliberates on matters that are complex, requires technical expertise. Committees can certainly help by this by providing domain experts, as we were talking about. And because there is no limit on the amount of data and domain experts you can have, the discussions really become extraordinary if you get into it. Like for example, when the surrogacy bill was being looked into by the Committee on Health and Family Welfare, they called the health secretary, they called the chairperson of the National Commission for Women, they called the head of department of gynecology from AIIMS, they called Supreme Court lawyers who were women, they called retired judges, they called everybody possible to come and give their views on a defined issue or a defined subject, right? Are we okay with this? Do we understand this? Right. Now, the committees can also provide a forum for building consensus across political parties, right? Now, the presiding officer, yes, can. And please don't interrupt me the same day. I don't have to keep telling you like children. Let me finish up. We'll take up your questions later. There are more than 3,000 students in class. Okay. Now, committees, of course, also require a forum for building political consensus. A lot of times, you will require the support of the Rajya Sabha. You will require support of parties which are in higher numbers in the Rajya Sabha without the formal need of a political majority. So that way, parliamentary committees become a lot like track 2 diplomacy. You know, in IR you have track 2 diplomacy. You meet on the sides of a summit, right? So that you can do your little talking and get some commonality on certain grounds. And apart from this, it also publishes its reports which are to be tabled in the parliament. And this, of course, helps the parliament look into issues with a great amount of detail. I've already mentioned the National Medical Commission example to you beforehand as well. Now, apart from this, we also understand some data sets. See, for example, the Consumer Act of 2019, which has completely replaced the 1986 Consumer Protection Law, right? This was recently done in I think 2 or 3 years ago in their budget sessions. Now, the earlier version of the bill was actually examined by the Committee of Consumer Affairs, which recommended certain amendments, certain changes, certain additional offenses such as misleading advertisements, making certain definitions clear. And the government accepted most of this without question. Now, the problem is this. I can't give you data for the 17th Lok Sabha because we are currently in the 17th Lok Sabha. And I hope and pray to whatever there is hope and pray to that you are not writing this exam in 2024 and all of you have cleared this exam by 2024. So you don't have to worry about the 17th Lok Sabha data because it will be too premature. But if you see the last 3 Lok Sabhas, there is a significant difference in the percentage of bills that have been referred to. Like for example, in 2014 to 19, that is the 16th Lok Sabha, just 25% of the bills were actually referred to the parliamentary committees. But if you see UPA 2, which is 2009 to 14, 71% of the bills were referred to parliamentary committees. Now, this is a good thing and a bad thing. It's a good thing because if you refer it to parliamentary committees, you're going to have a greater sense of understanding, a greater sense of examination. It is a bad thing, and it could definitely be a bad thing if and only if you are delaying the process and the committees are extremely slow. So you have to balance delay in lawmaking and a proper democratic deliberative discourse in understanding parliamentary committees. Okay, so that's that. Now, by the way, if before the mains exam also, I'll give you updates to all of this. ये पूरा हर 6 महीने में मैं सब कुछ अपडेट करता हूँ, so that your core arguments remain the same. There are new arguments, I will add them, but मैं हमेशा आपको डेटा एकदम चकाचक नया देता रहता हूँ. Right now, for example, the departmentally related standing committees also examine the budget. They help you formulate your demand for grants and all of that. We were discussing yesterday, right, that most of the demand for grants don't even get discussed on the floor of the house. So the only way Lok Sabha, Rajya Sabha, the ministry, everybody sits together and helps them to come to an amount, to come to a policy discourse, which is the budget. You will see that that there is actually deliberation that happens in those. Because if you understand that the budget being passed in the Lok Sabha is a snap of a finger exercise, which is why you must understand that these committees have had a very strong role. Like for example, in the 16th Lok Sabha, the departmentally related standing committees had examined 41 bills, 331 DOGs, 197 issues, and had published about 503 reports. And if you see this worrying trend, now this is of course the COVID year, and of course this is also election year. Now you must understand, election years, why is there 0%? It's because it is an interim budget, right? That is why it's a 0%, right? So only 20% of your demand for grants actually get discussed. Most of them are just voted rather superficially, which is why there is enough reason for you to want to have what are called substantial parliamentary committees, right? Now, what are the basic issues? There are often mains questions from here. Over a period of time, as I was telling you, the number of bills that are referred to parliamentary committees, they have been substantially reduced. Second, this is true for something which is across the entire governance ecosystem. Like for example, Bhavna, is this really important for you to put this in the middle of the class? I'll look into it. Don't worry. Okay? After that. Yes, Ankit. Don't worry about it. Yeah. I'll give a separate PDF for any additions. And thanks for breaking the flow of the class, guys. You're very kind of you. Now, this is true for longer tenure issues also. Like for example, you are barely a district magistrate of a specific district for about 2 years. You may be a district magistrate for 5-6 years, but of different districts. So by the time you figure out what the problems of the district are and what your vision to improve the district is, the time is gone, the essence is gone, the setup is gone, and therefore you don't need to really get into the details behind it. And that is why you get transferred, and therefore you don't really get that continuity of policy making. So that's the first idea and the first explanation. The second explanation here is the second explanation here is that even at the secretary level, you will barely see, education secretary, home secretary, these guys being a secretary for more than 2.5 to 3 years. So by the time they figure out what the sector is and how the ministry is supposed to function, and they have to execute certain important projects, they often get transferred or they're often retired from the entire process. This is also true for committees also, because the average duration of a committee, and most committees, the members change every 1 year. So therefore, by the time they figure out what needs to be done and what doesn't need to be done, it is often the members change. Then you also require some kind of technical research support, right? How you have the Lamb Fellowship for MPs, you should actually have a government research service or some form of it, which can of course look into helping the committees with research reports, policy reports. Otherwise, what happens is the government hires consultants. These consultants are paid heavily by the government, and therefore the consultants will give a report which of course the government will stand by, and the parliamentary committees don't have the money to afford expensive consultants, law firms, or policy agencies and so on and so forth. Right, so that's an issue. And of course there are discussions on committee reports also. Now, because a lot of times the parliament really doesn't care too much, and your committee reports are not taken up with the same kind of seriousness as it should be, and a lot of times the members don't attend a lot of the parliamentary committees, and often, because as I was telling you, like for example for labor, culture, tourism, etc., they're all in one. So there are too many ministries that are often overburdened with their kind of work. And there are certain norms, there are certain rules that try and appoint MPs on a rotational basis, and try and appoint people who will be able to have some subject expertise. But this is often not done, and these are all political appointments. And maybe the most educated MPs do not get to be a part of these committees. So these are some of the broad issues which are involved in the committee system per se. Right? Now, apart from that, there are some basic suggestions that are needed. As far as the basic suggestions are concerned, strengthening committees and scrutinizing reports are extremely important in a timely manner. Therefore, the discussion must also be encouraged. A constitutional committee should also be set up to examine constitutional amendments, and so that we have planning constitutional amendments throughout the year in a more organized way. A legislative planning committee or a constitution committee should also be there, instead of them just showing up on the floor of the house. And a legislative committee should also be there to figure out, okay, this point of the year we're looking at setting up these bills for the discussion. Apart from this, you should actually have an oversight committee to see how the other committees are functioning, and you should have proper online summits and other mediums where you and I as ordinary people can contribute our discussions. And of course, there should be a defined procedure in the rules that X kind of bills must definitely be sent to parliamentary committees, or Y kind of issues must be referred to parliamentary committees. And there should be some form of an evaluation, and that evaluation should be both qualitative and quantitative. A quantitative would be the number of sittings you had, the number of reports that you submitted, and a qualitative discussion could be the depth of it, the quality of recommendations, the level of the knowledge of our MPs, and so on and so forth. But all of this is very important to fundamentally strengthen the ecosystem of parliamentary committees in our country. Okay, and of course, these are also echoed by the National Commission to Review the Working of the Constitution, where they've also recommended the same. And they've also said that have a National Economy Committee to look at, how your incomes are evaluated, your GDP stats are evaluated, how the economy as a whole is performing, and not just rely on CAG and public accounts, which is just a fraction of what your larger fiscal policy decisions in and around have to be, right? For your means, there are some international examples, such as the UK, the US, Canada, where you see a lot more work, a lot more decisions that are often taken. And sometimes it is also argued that some parliamentary committee meetings can also be televised. Like, for example, the Delhi Legislative Assembly Committee recently had invited Facebook to depose in front of the committee to examine their role in the Delhi riots, right? Similarly, internationally, you would have seen Google CEO, Facebook CEO, them being called before, US parliamentary committees. Back in the day, about 10-15 years ago, there was a Murdoch Committee. The Murdoch Committee was a huge media scandal in the UK, where the privacy of the royal family was breached, and their personal photos and their personal communications were released in the public space, which is extremely not allowed, is completely disallowed in their domain and in their ecosystem, right? So these are things that we must know. These are things that make a lot of difference in our understanding. So you can use some examples from here. Now our basic understanding of parliamentary committees is over. It's going to take me about half an hour or so to cover up some bits of state legislative councils, and then we're going to pick up some portions of private member bills and do some data sets. So we can study for some time, then I'll give you a 10-minute break after half an hour, 40 minutes. Okay? Wherever there are two committees, members of both houses, there usually will be 2:1, but that's not necessarily for joint and select committees, but for parliamentary committees, yes. All right. So that's something that we've covered. Now, I also wanted to cover some issues with respect to private member bills first. Then I'll come to state legislative councils, because this was in the news and this was also in the paper this year. And for those who've studied with me before, if you've seen the drive, I'd actually put this before the mains exam, and there was a direct question from state legislative councils in the main exam. And if you check the date of upload on the drive, it is way before the mains exam. So we were very happily able to predict a full question on state legislative councils in the mains exam, right? Okay. There was a small section that I had to cover from private member bills. Just give me a minute. Rest everything else we've covered from the top part. Just private member bills are left. Then we will do state legislative councils and some amount of data that you can use in your mains exam. Okay. So why are we talking about this? Because private member bills are basically bills that are barely ever passed in the history of the country, and we should really try and encourage good private member bills to be discussed. This was a matter of controversy in December because a private member in the Rajya Sabha wanted to introduce a bill, a constitutional amendment bill, which could perhaps amend the preamble as well. Now, after Keshavananda Bharati, the preamble got amended in 1976, but after 1976, in a different judgment than Keshavananda Bharati, the Supreme Court had said that the preamble is basic structure, and that is why there has been a debate as to whether the preamble can be or cannot be amended. Right? Now, when we look at the context is that in the winter session that happened last year, in this November and December, between the end of November to the end of December, which is why I usually like to call it the December winter session, because it almost starts from December only. There were 26 bills that were listed for introduction, consideration and passing. Out of these, there were 15 private member bills, 15 private member bills in the Rajya Sabha, and 10 private member bills in the Lok Sabha. Some of the very interesting ones was that there was a private member bill to clearly define plagiarism as an issue. The second was, of course, on universal healthcare, that we must provide anybody and everybody, irrespective of who they are, some health support, and a bill to also set up population control agencies at the district level, so that we are able to have better population policies leading to better sort of welfare dividends. There were also 5 private member bills with respect to the Constitution. One, of course, as I was telling you, with respect to the preamble. There was also an anti-defection amendment to the 10th schedule, I think by KTS Tulsi, where you wanted to add 3 months as your maximum time to decide. There was another private member bill which wanted to increase the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha seats, also give increase the union territory representation to the Lok Sabha, and also provide for women reservation. There was also another private member bill which wanted Chandigarh to also be represented in the Rajya Sabha, and the last one which wanted to define instances of contempt better. Contempt is contempt of court, as you would remember. So you will often see a ton of private member bills which are often placed on the floor of the house. There is a Parliament information system that you can always check out, which gives you a list of these things. But again, it's a database that we as teachers refer to, you as students don't really have to, because it's unnecessarily complex and will take a lot of your time, right? So I'll show you how this works, right? I'll tell you the database that I'm referring to, and you'll understand why is this not for you. Suppose I go to the Rajya Sabha, right? Now, just give me a second. No, sorry. I'll show this to you in a while. I can't immediately locate it. I'll come back to this in a while. It's not bookmarked on this browser, so that is why I have to keep searching on it. But I'll show this to you in a while. Okay, sorry for the delay. Anyways, but I'll show this to you in some time. Okay, now, what are your private member bills? See, your private member bills are those which are introduced by those who's not a minister and is called a private member. Private member bills are bills which are introduced by these MPs. We've cleared this out. This is extremely okay. This is fine. Now, in the Lok Sabha, this is something that we were discussing in the process also. The last 2.5 hours of a sitting on every Friday are generally allotted for private member businesses, so that enough time and attention has to be taken. Now, what has happened is that till date, there have, in the 70 plus years of this country's existence, not even 70 private member bills, 14 private member bills have actually been passed. And out of these, 6 were in 1956. And the last time we passed a private member bill was in 1970. And therefore, what usually happens is that the second a party comes to power, their contributions of private member bills often decreases. Now, you must understand why this is a problem. This is a problem because it is affecting the individual performance of an MP or an MLA, for that matter. They're similar. Two, just because your party has the government, is able to form a ministry, that doesn't mean that the ministry has all the time to focus on all the issues that they should. And therefore, what usually ends up happening is that a lot of issues get ignored, which is what private members can take up. And it also has an impact on the constructive role of the opposition, where the opposition is not able to function in the same manner as it could, as it should, and as it will. Right? So these are, of course, your issues with private member bills, and this is something I wanted to cover and touch base before we move to the other parts of it all in our discussions. Now, how is the procedure and what is the basic idea? It is usually done through a ballot. This is not in your standard textbooks, and the Committee on Private Member Bills and Resolutions classifies them on their nature, urgency, and importance, and then each house decides the relative precedence in each category, which basically means that the house basically decides which private member bill should be taken up or which should not be taken up, which is why majority plays a very, very strong role, which is why opposition private member bills are barely ever taken up. I remember after the homosexuality judgment, before the Navtej Singh Johar judgment, after the Nas Foundation judgment, Shashi Tharoor had tried to introduce a private member bill on decriminalizing homosexuality by the parliament. But it got defeated, it never reached on voting and all of those things. So that's also there, right? We've covered parliamentary privilege. I've given you the impact of it. And this is all that we need to know as far as private member bills are concerned. We've covered privileges already. We've understood what they are, what they are not. From a disqualification perspective, for the offline batches day before yesterday, for the online batches, please go through them. I've added some important notes to this. It'll make your life far, far easy. Now, the topic that we are left is state legislative councils. Now, state legislative councils have to be done in a specific manner. The reason I wanted to include this in the notes for this year is because West Bengal had requested for a state legislative council and was already asked in the mains exam. So I do not think that this is going to be asked again next year. But just to give you a broad overview, that the reason why we're talking about this is because the Chief Minister of West Bengal during her Legislative Assembly elections lost from her constituency and and therefore had 6 months to become an MLA or an MLC so that she could continue being the Chief Minister. And therefore what ended up happening was that she continued to, then of course she became an MLA from elsewhere. There was a by-election of some sort, but this was understood by the West Bengal party that we must have a second house because it gives us a better deliberation process, and also it helps us look into the finer details of policy making, and also is, whether we like it or not, a safe haven for our political parties. Now, Article 161 allows for the Parliament to do this. The creation or the abolition of a legislative council is done by the Parliament. This is an application of rule number 2, and this is not an amendment under Article 368. It's extremely important. And before the Parliament does it, the state has to request for it. So if the state has not requested for it, the Parliament does not have the powers to create a legislative council. And just because the state has requested it doesn't mean that the Parliament has to create a legislative council. Bengal, Assam and a couple of states have been requesting for it for a long time, right? And we know this from our majorities. I've discussed this in our first classes, that the state legislature assembly has to pass it with a special majority 1, which is more than 2/3 of present and voting. Now, at present, there are 6 states such as Andhra, Telangana, UP, Maharashtra, Bihar and Karnataka where councils exist. J&K also had one, but since J&K has now been made a union territory with a legislative assembly, it does not have a council anymore. And in fact, J&K is the only state in the country who has been demoted, in a manner of speaking, to a union territory. All other union territories have mostly been promoted, but J&K is one which has been demoted, right? Now, composition is that you will not have more than 1/3 of the total strength, and In no cases you will have less than 40 members. There are certain exceptions to the states of Sikkim, etc., for legislative assemblies, so they could also be correlated here. Now, similarly, very similar to the Rajya Sabha, each MLC gets to be there for 6 years, but on a rotational basis that is started from a ballot system. 1/3 of the MLCs retire after every 2 years. We've covered this up in our initial discussions also. And as far as your council is concerned, we've done this for all the batches before. I've just put this down on a table just in case you want to go through this at a given point of time. And when we compare it, this is the important part. You see how the Rajya Sabha gets diminished powers with respect to financial bills. The Constitution has not given any additional powers to the legislative councils. In fact, the legislative assemblies can override any suggestions or any suggestions or amendments made by the council for any kind of a bill. With the case of the Rajya Sabha, if an ordinary bill or a constitutional amendment bill or a financial bill is rejected by the Rajya Sabha, it is a deadlock. And you can't have a joint sitting for a constitutional amendment, but for everything else you can have a joint sitting. The Rajya Sabha is under no obligation to necessarily say yes to a constitutional amendment either, right? However, with the legislative councils, they necessarily can be overridden by the assembly under all circumstances, right? Now, usually what happens is that Rajya Sabha MPs are a part of the electoral college, which participate in the presidential election. We've done this before, but MLCs are not, because MLCs are not uniform. Rajya Sabha MPs participate in presidential and vice presidential elections collectively. Now, the chairperson of the Rajya Sabha is the ex officio vice president, but that's not the case with the chairperson of the council. The council is like the speaker of the other house. You're elected through simple majority and you're removed through through effective majority. Now, why did we create a legislative council? Because we have a bicameral system, so the state should also have the ability to have a heightened electorate, a more educated electorate, a more representative electorate, to ensure that people who may not win elections in the colloquial grassroots manner are still being able to be given a place in the parliament. 2, of course, it is a check and balance on hasty and populist actions. 3, it facilitates diversity in the legislative process, primarily because you're able to have so many different sections of society participating in so many different methods, like graduates, like teachers, local bodies, elected MLAs, and so on and so forth. And when you have local bodies, it also creates a sense of local self-government integration with of course, what is called your legislative council. So this is extremely important. What are your primary issues with legislative councils? A, they're superfluous and mischievous. Why is that the case? It's that the case because you'll often see that the legislative councils will have people from the same political party who are in majority in the assembly because they have ground support. And often this is used as a method to safeguard people who may have not won an election or may be losing the next election for that matter. And if that's not the case, and if the opposition has more members, the opposition will unnecessarily start rejecting bills, and it will unnecessarily make a delay. Because the powers are limited and the assembly can override everything that the council does, it really is not an effective check as the Rajya Sabha is. And third, you must understand that legislative councils can often work for a political agenda, can work for some vested interests, and of course have a backdoor entrance. And at the end of the day, all of this costs money, right? Infrastructure, human resources, and that money will come from the state, and of course the center might also have to provide for it. And that is why we often say that we should have a national policy on this, wherein there should be a limited criteria, there should be an entire mechanism, and 2, there should be a review of how you have two seats for graduates and teachers should also be reviewed, and 3, all of this is that if there's a wide range of reasons for debates and public intellect and public sort of knowledge to be sort of flown in the upper houses, then it should be done for all the houses. It should not be just for a few houses, for a few states, and it should not be that a few states have councils whereas a few states don't have councils. When that happens, of course, there seems to always be a larger sense of issue, right? So this is your basic understanding of legislative councils. We've covered basics of it. I've just given you a few points. This is not going to be asked in 2022 mains because you've just done it in 2021 mains. Even if you don't do an analysis of councils and go for your mains exam this year, you are completely sorted. In the pre, you anyways know the basic. You don't have to worry too much about it in a fair amount of detail, right? We are done with parliamentary committees. I wanted to sort of run you through some data sets because they're sort of important. Rajya Sabha was also asked a while ago, and I've given you the election process and everything for Rajya Sabha here, just in case you want to go through it. We've discussed all of this in detail. We've discussed the validity of the Rajya Sabha and all of those things. The second house and why is it important and how does it come about. Just about 2 years ago, there was a question on the analysis of the Rajya Sabha. I don't see this to be asked again in 2022, but I've given you these notes just in case. For the older batches also, I've updated these a little bit. So there is some historical context that it was also originated from the 1919 Act and then the 35 Act, and in the middle, women and poor people were not allowed to have voting rights. India decided to have your unicameral setup. There were people both for and against it. People who were for Rajya Sabha said you'll get better legislative discourses. People who were against said it'll be an unnecessary sort of dramatic component to the entire ecosystem. This is your election procedure. We've discussed this before. I've also discussed the vote mechanisms and I've given you a very simple ecosystem of how this works. Rajya Sabha election processes are not asked in the exam because they are different for every seat vacancy. But in case you want to read more about it, I've given it to you in 4-5 very simple points that you can understand and you can clearly fathom. Then, of course, this is important. The Rajya Sabha elections have a system of an open ballot, but it is a limited open ballot, which means when elected MLAs are participating in a Rajya Sabha election, in that scenario, there will be, if this is the ballot box, there'll be a party representative right in front. So you only have to show your vote to the party representative. You don't have to show it to everybody else. So it has what is called a limited openness, and you don't have the nota option in Rajya Sabha elections, and it was declared so by the Supreme Court, right? We've done comparative powers between Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha already. This is just in case you want to write about this in the mains exam, given it to you here. Then some details of Rajya Sabha powers and how do they function, and a comparative review. Key in legislation, they have equal powers. Deadlock, again, they have equal powers. Joint sitting, only the presiding officer on priority has to be from the Lok Sabha. Otherwise, of course, both have equal powers to vote however they want to. Financial, Rajya Sabha is a weak house. We've discussed money bills. Executive, we've discussed this in the sense that they can ask questions. Ministers can also be from the Rajya Sabha. Even the PM can be from the Rajya Sabha. We've done some electoral functions also. They participate in elections to the president, elections to the vice president. They choose a deputy chairperson from amongst themselves. And of course, apart from this, they perform judicial functions like removing the president, removing Supreme Court or High Court judges, removing the vice president, or in fact also your constitutional bodies such as Attorney General, Auditor General, or the Comptroller Auditor General, or the Chief Election Commissioner, or Election Commissioners per se. So these are the broad sort of powers. You've done most of them before. There are some things that the Rajya Sabha can do that nobody else can. So to declare a state list as a subject of national importance, All India Services will do this in center-state relations. And of course, they have equal powers of ordinances, ratifications of emergencies. We'll do this in center-state, changes to High Court, Supreme Court jurisdictions, and changes to qualifications. We'll do these in a fair amount of detail later in electoral and center-state relations, but this is broadly how it is. Then, of course, a general gyan on why is Rajya Sabha important. It's a safety valve for federalism, checks and balances. It therefore provides for, effective review of work. It also has a revisionary role wherein populism can be kept at a check. And when the Lok Sabha is suffering from brute majority, so to speak, the Rajya Sabha would possibly look at it from an independent view, from an independent perspective, right? Apart from this, it represents vulnerable sections. If done right, it is a deliberative body, and I've told you it has certain special powers, right? Some concluding statements in case you want to write about this in an essay. I don't think this is going to be asked in any amount of detail because just was done last year. I've still given it here for those of you who want extensive reading, or for those of you who have political science as an optional and need to sort of give some context in depth to bicameralism, right? And the issues also, again, will not be asked, but unequal representation, and a lot of times bills are Amnish, that's because the PM is chosen from the mandate of the popularly elected party. We are not a presidential system. And of course, a lot of times bills are bypassed through the Rajya Sabha by deeming them to be an Aadhaar bill, like a money bill, like an Aadhaar bill, and so on and so forth, like tribunals also. And it has therefore undermined the federal character of the Rajya Sabha because domicile is no longer required. Nominated members are not that vociferously participative. And of course, like for example, Sachin Tendulkar has not been a very good Rajya Sabha member. And please don't murder me for it, but he's a great cricketer, but not a very good Rajya Sabha member, so to speak, right? With respect to money bills, of course, I've given you a statement here. There are joint sittings, I've given you some statements here. And what can be done? I've sort of laid this down. First, you should have, that there's a recommendation by the ARC that Rajya Sabha should be elected directly by the citizens. But the problem is that if that happens, then what is the difference between the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha? My volume is top notch. Like I can see my audio input to be high. Second, you should at least have alternate equal distribution of seats across all the houses. And third, to make sure that there is a better discussion and a better procedure for nomination, there should be an appointments committee like they have in the UK, where people should be chosen on merit and not from political patronage. So that is something that should be done. Your conclusion is, good or bad, Rajya Sabha has been very important for diversity, for representation. It should not be seen as a disruptive wing, and in fact should often be seen as, should always be seen as something which is contemplative in nature, which is assistive in nature, and also makes us understand that no doubt we are not as weak as UK's House of Lords, and we're not as strong as the American Senate. We're somewhere in the middle, but they're extremely, extremely important. And of course, we should now look at a more constructive outlook to make it function better. ठीक है? इसके ऊपर आप कुछ कर लो. पार्लियामेंट, स्टेट लेजिस्लेचर्स, यहाँ से ना प्री में ना मेंस में इन 2 दिन के बियॉन्ड कुछ नहीं आएगा. देयर आर सम डेटा सेट्स. आई विल जस्ट क्विकली शो यू सम डेटा सेट्स जो आपके सिलेबस में भी है, in the sense that you'll be able to quote them in the mains exam in a better manner. So that is why I have kept them here in the parliament itself. अगर आप इसको थोड़ा सा ऊपर देखेंगे, मैंने आपको बीच बीच में थोड़े थोड़े डेटा सेट्स दे रखे हैं. You will be using them only and only in the mains exam, not in the prelims. तो ये जो कुछ डेटा सेट्स हैं, ये वाले यहाँ से, राइट. तो ये थोड़े से डेटा सेट्स आप एक बार देख लीजिए. प्री के पहले, मेंस के पहले काम आएंगे, मैं ये अपडेट कर दूंगा. बट 17th लोकसभा है, देयर इजंट अ लॉट दैट इज बीइंग चेंज्ड. ओके, यस विशाल, एब्सोल्युटली. अब पावर्स नहीं पूछेंगे प्री में तो क्या पूछेंगे? Yes, people, we have to wait for 10-15 days. Now, this is the 16th Lok Sabha, that is the 17th Lok Sabha. Basic फर्क देखिए, you will see a lot of, you have lesser first term MPs, मतलब पहली बार MP बने हैं ऐसे लोग कम हैं. So obviously दोबारा जो बने हैं वो ज़्यादा हैं, right? और an MP does not have to necessarily be Lok Sabha, it could also be Rajya Sabha. So of course, we are seeing a reduction in first term MPs because it's the similar kind of government, NDA 1, NDA 2, BJP 1, BJP 2. So you will see a repetition also. But if you still see, if there are 169 new MPs, which is a very, very good sort of number to deal with, right? Now, when we look at data in terms of age, the average age of an MP is about 54 years and just have less than 15% between the age group of 25 to 40. तो हमारे युवा नेता actually 50 साल के होते हैं. And contrary to popular belief, 75% of our Lok Sabha MPs have been graduates. Are they good graduates or bad graduates is a different story. And of course, 394 MPs have at least graduate level education across Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha. Right? Now, when we look at data, there are of course more women than we could have, but still there are negligible women, given that almost half the country's population comprises of women, right? Almost half the country's population comprises of women. And in such a scenario, if that is the case, right, so at least half of them have, half of the country's population are women, and unfortunately we don't even have 30% of our MPs as women. As you can see, about 14% of the current Lok Sabha has women. This has been a good number, change from 5%, but still is negligible. If you actually compare it to, say, Rwanda, South Africa, UK, US, and Bangladesh, we are far, far behind. Rwanda also, because of the Rwandan genocide, happens to be the only country in the world which has proper reservation for women across all boards and all levels in the ecosystem. Okay? Understood this? Then you of course have parliamentary committees. With respect to parliamentary committees, with respect to the Lok Sabha professional profiles, you will see most of them are political and social service. अब ये political and social service क्या होता है मुझे नहीं पता, but कुछ तो होता है, ठीक है. 38% are engaged in agricultural activities, yet they don't have a view on farm laws. And there are some who actually do two things, right? So lawyer भी हैं, कुछ teacher भी हैं. Lawyer teacher मिला के 4% 6% है, ठीक है. And then of course you've covered your basics of Rajya Sabha, ठीक है. तो ये आपके डेटा सेट्स है. इसके ऊपर एग्जाम में कुछ आएगा नहीं, ये मीन्स के लिए है. कुछ अपडेट्स होंगे तो मैं अलग से आपको शेयर कर दूंगा, बट इतना प्रिपेयर करके जाएंगे आप 10 जगह यूज़ कर सकते हैं. सो विमेन इन पार्लियामेंट इज समथिंग यू कैन यूज़ ऑन जेंडर ऑल्सो. एजुकेशन एंड MP एजुकेशन यू कैन यूज़ इन एजुकेशन पॉलिसी ऑल्सो. तो ये सारी चीज़ें हैं जो आपको कवर करनी चाहिए, ठीक है. नाउ यू कैन टेक अ 10-minute break, have a cup of tea if you want to. Any doubts you have, you can put in the comment box. I'll have a look at them now. And then we'll start with separation of powers and checks and balances. ठीक है? All right. कोई दिक्कत आसान है ना? कोई मुश्किल हुई कि सर ऐसा क्यों नहीं है? The tough part of polity is over. अभी सब बहुत चिल है. It's nothing but a power sharing game. किसको वहाँ पावर चाहिए, किसको यहाँ पावर चाहिए, ठीक है. All right. Yes, preamble is as per the Supreme Court judgment, yes. Rajya Sabha also has political parties and therefore whips can be issued. The source of this data is PRS. Ritika, I usually don't look at the camera because I'm too focused on thinking of what to say, but I'll try and look into the camera. Yes, Rudra. Is anti-defection applicable in Rajya Sabha also? Yes. Yes, Akshat. Yes, Ankit. Suransh, you can get in touch with me by email. Yes, Himanshu, absolutely. The lengthy process, Vivek, is because it's about opportunity, it's not about outcome. Democracy is all about opportunity. It is very difficult for a private member to get the kind of majority. It's virtually impossible. But that does not mean that the private member should not be given an opportunity, because hope springs eternal, my man. Right? That is why. Okay. All right. Okay. Polity will be over by Sunday, boss. Yeah. Chalo. We're now going to look at separation of powers and checks and balances, which is often one of the most misunderstood topics. People don't understand that mostly ordinances, judicial review, judicial activism, all of tribunals, these are actually issues of separation of powers and checks and balances. So our topic is separation of powers between various organs, dispute redressal mechanisms, and institutions. Right? Now, apart from alternate dispute resolution, which is a subtopic of judiciary, judicial review, judicial activism, ordinances, tribunals, these are institutional issues we'll cover as applications of separation of powers. To quickly run you through the kind of questions that are asked, for example, ordinances and separation of powers. This is ADR, this is judicial review and how is it important for basic structure. Similarly, tribunals curtail the jurisdiction of ordinary courts, and therefore is it an issue of separation of powers? A theoretical question on do we have a strict separation of powers or not? A very specific issue in 2019 where the Central Administrative Tribunal had given certain judgments which were transgressing into the domain of the executive, and judicial legislation, which is nothing but the judiciary in the garb of a judgment writing down the policy which has to be implemented, like the Vishakha case, and relating it to PILs was in 2020. So there are a certain set number of questions that are often asked from here, and we should prepare them in the right sort of a manner. Okay, so let us start. Okay, we'll start first with the theory of separation of powers. In case you get an essay, so you need some more details. In case you get a basic GS question, this is more than enough. So let's see how this works. Now, separation of powers, as we understand, is nothing but the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary to be left alone to do what they do. And why do you need it? Where does the concept come from? Let's spend some time on it. The originator of a concept like this was, of course, a political philosopher called Aristotle, who in this book called Politics or Politico had discussed the concept of separation of powers. And he said that in a heterogeneous form of government, where you have different agencies in place, you should usually have three branches of government: the deliberative, the public officials, and of course the judiciary. Now, this was later dealt with in a lot more detail by Montesquieu, who studied the British parliamentary system and understood the context of separation of powers rather well. Now, he said, and he coined the terms, that there should be an executive, a legislature, and a judiciary. The doer of laws, the maker of laws, and of course the challenger of laws. And this setup, for the first time, gave a scientific and a systematic formulation. Montesquieu, in his book called The Spirit of the Laws, or Esprit des Lois, which is in the year 1749, also around the same time as the French Revolution. Right now, his book, as you would know, is based on the British constitutional model, who understood that the British model was originally a separation between the monarch, who actually had real powers, the parliament, and of course the courts of law. Now, the basic premise here is as to why do you need separation of powers is, see, if the executive starts making laws, or if the executive starts deciding on whether a law is being violated, right? Like, for example, if the DM is making laws and the DM is also deciding, whether a murder was committed or not, this would of course give too much power to the DM, and of course will threaten the liberty of the individuals and a certain sense of societal sanity. If the legislature would also end up, looking at executive or judicial functions, then the laws would be unnecessarily arbitrary and of course end liberty, because political philosophy and state is always centered around the notions of liberty. And the judiciary, if also starts doing so, then we will end up having a judicial dictatorship. If a military dictatorship is a problem, so is a judicial dictatorship. Okay, now, our constitution also recognizes this. It's nowhere mentioned in the constitution directly, though in directive principles we mention a specific part of it, which is separation of the judiciary from the executive. Why? Because in a lot of remote areas in our country where you do not have enough lower judicial officers, lower judicial functionaries, the elected executive, you guys as the executive magistrate, also run some courts. These are courts of small causes, courts of revenue, courts of land. So that is why we need to start separating it. There's also been an amendment to the CRPC with regards to the same. And of course, we are trying as much as possible. Even till today, several of you who will end up becoming SDMs or DMs at some point will end up also running courts in your own offices or your residences. Anyways, so this is largely the basic context of separation of powers. This is what it is. In the exam, you may get a theoretical question. So this can be an introduction, can be a historical context to these things. Now, when we look at separation of powers, we must understand why do you need it. There are primarily 5 reasons, because these get asked in the mains exam. The first reason, as you would know it, is that it eliminates any form of arbitrariness, totalitarianism, and tyranny. What does that mean? It means if everybody knows exactly what they're supposed to do, they will not encroach into anybody else's work area, and also at the same time, they will be accountable to each other. It's very important for you to understand separation of powers gives birth to checks and balances. If you don't have proper separation of powers, you will not be able to have proper checks and balances, which is why in a parliamentary system, checks and balances become slightly diminished, because the executive is nothing but a subset of the legislature, right? That is why the parliament does not be a very effective tool of accountability. And therefore, you must promote accountability and democratic forms of government. Secondly, it also prevents the misuse of powers between different organs of the government. How does that happen? See, the Indian Constitution, which is supposed to essentially work on the principles of constitutionalism, would say that the powers of the government has to be restricted. So what you end up doing, separation of powers has not been done for all batches, right? So just give me a few minutes. वैष्णवी जी, आपको हमने बताया था ट्रिब्यूनल्स हम थोड़ी देर में शुरू करेंगे, तो टेंशन मत लीजिए, right? Now, so what happens is that the Indian Constitution, which is a document which controls or which controls the power of the government also distributes the power of the government. And in India, the constitution is the ultimate body, the sovereign body, the supreme law, and anything that goes wrong against constitutional principles must often be declared as unconstitutional. And thirdly, as I said, it gives rise to principles of checks and balances, therefore making them accountable. And fourthly, separation of powers also maintains a balance between the three organs of government so that one is not overpowered over the other. And lastly, it also allows them to specialize within their own domains, where they can think of having the best forms of laws, the best forms of implementation mechanisms, and of course, the best forms of judgments therein. Okay? So these are things that we must know under all circumstances. Okay? Separation of powers in the context of the UK Constitution. See, it is very important to do this on a comparative basis. The UK practices a unitary parliamentary monarchical setup in terms of the constitution, and the separation of powers in the UK is applied, but it's not in the rigid sense because the UK does not have a written constitution. So if you do not have a single document which is necessary for federalism, and you don't have a single document which tells you these are the powers of the government and this is how government powers start from branch to branch and end from branch to branch, there will always be an overlap. Okay, there will always be an overlap, right? And this is of course an issue, right? इसी के बाद ट्राइब्यूनल्स आएगा, तो थोड़ा सा शांति रखिए भाई लोग, ठीक है? Okay. Now, in the UK, you don't have a constitutional supremacy because you don't have a written constitution. So what ends up happening is that the parliament becomes the sovereign rule-making body, and the government is therefore answerable to the parliament, and the executive is controlled by the Lok Sabha equivalent, which is the House of Commons. So what ends up happening is that the parliament enjoys the highest authority to control every power structure in the UK. So separation of powers becomes an extremely difficult process. The judiciary, on the other hand, of course, is fiercely independent, and of course, the judges of the Supreme Court can be removed by the other two branches, by the legislature. It's also very interesting to notice that the UK, which is one of the oldest democracies in the world, also has one of the youngest Supreme Courts in the world. The UK Supreme Court is functional has only become functional as late as what is called 2010, 2011, right? So that is something that we must know and appreciate. Before that, the UK Supreme Court was an extension of the House of Lords, which was of course fairly problematic in terms of separation of powers, right? Now, in the US, because it's a presidential system, this is the true ecosystem of separation of powers. The US has a written constitution, is governed by the presidential form. The constitution is clear. The separation of powers principles are explicitly, if I'm not wrong, section 3 of or clause 2 of the US Constitution refers to separation of powers, very clearly mentioned, very clearly, that this is what separation of powers means. In fact, the terms are also clearly defined. And what happens is, then, because the head of the state and the head of the government is the president gets to choose their own ministers, who are called secretaries, right? And they are not members of the houses. Here, our ministers are members of the houses. The prime minister is a member of the house. There, that's not the case, and therefore, the president of the US, who's also the prime minister of the US, what ends up happening here is that you get absolute independence on deciding who your ministers have to be. They can be from any and every walk of life, which is why Donald Trump was also often criticized for appointing his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, to several key positions in the US government. And the tenure of the president, the tenure of the secretaries are not dependent on the Congress, right? And therefore, the Congress becomes a sovereign body. It has its own two houses. They do their own thing. The president and the president's secretariat does its own thing. No doubt, there is checks and balances. The president can theoretically be removed by the Congress. There's a very detailed procedure on it, and an extremely complicated procedure is a complicated procedure at that. And not only this, the treaties which are often entered into by the president need to be approved by the Senate, and the Supreme Court of the US is unquestionably independent, despite the judges to be removed by the houses of the Parliament of the US, right? And therefore, the courts have all powers to declare all actions of the legislature or the executive unconstitutional upon objection. So the basic difference is, बहुत सिंपल है कि हमारे यहाँ आप कितना भी सेपरेशन ऑफ पावर्स चिल्ला लो, एट द एंड ऑफ द डे मंत्री तो हाउस से ही आता है ना, तो मिली भगत तो है ही है। यूएस में ऐसा नहीं है। यूएस के मंत्री अलग से चुने जाते हैं, डायरेक्ट लैटरल एंट्री अपॉइंटमेंट है, कोई इलेक्शन नहीं, कुछ नहीं, सिर्फ प्रेसिडेंट का इलेक्शन होता है, राइट? So those are the powers of the president in the US as compared to India. Now, you must understand that the president in the US also interferes in the functioning of the Congress because they have a heightened veto power and also plays a role in the appointment of judges. And the Congress also, in terms of separation of powers, makes its own procedural laws, can also have special courts, can also approve the appointment of judges. And the judiciary can, of course, review the actions of the Congress and the president. So, in terms of the US, separation of powers in its ideal form, or closest to ideal form, really exists. It's not the ideal form, but it's the closest to an ideal form which sort of exists. Okay, now let's look at it in terms of India. See, in India, we have to just do permutations, combinations. Separation of powers, LEJ. तो कब LE का काम कर रहा है, EJ का काम कर रहा है, JE का काम कर रहा है, we just do that. It's a very simple exercise. So the Indian Constitution, as I said, does not clearly mention this. In fact, what happened during the Constituent Assembly debates was that there was a member called K.T. Shah who wanted to propose an amendment to the Constitution under 40A, which wanted to provide for a complete separation of powers across all the branches. But this was not passed by the Constituent Assembly, but was definitely a point of view which was there. B.R. Ambedkar, however, said, you know what, it is important, hona chahiye, but also said that in a country like India, the L, E and J are also unequivocally dependent on each other. You need all of them to work together, and we need all of them to support each other so that they can be the best forms of government that there can be, which is essentially what we are talking about. Right? Now, when we look at constitutional provisions supporting separation of powers, and we must understand these as well as we can, you see constitutional provisions that say that there is proper separation of powers is, say, 53 and 154, where the executive powers of union and states are respectively with the president and governor. ये mains में exam में लिखना आएगा, ठीक है? For 245 says very clearly that there are different powers for the center and the states to make laws on, supplemented by 246 and Schedule 7. 50 clearly says that there should be a separation of the judiciary from the executive. So kahin na kahin there are core provisions which are supporting separation of powers in terms of distinct work कि आपका अपना काम है, मेरा अपना काम है. ये काम कहाँ लिखा है? ये यहाँ पे लिखा है. ये एग्जीक्यूटिव के लिए, ये लेजिस्लेचर के लिए, ये जुडिशरी के लिए. नाउ वी लुक एट, डू यू हैव द इंडिपेंडेंस टू डू योर वर्क? Like for example, 122 and 212 say the courts can't get into the proceedings of the parliament and the legislatures respectively. It is a violation. That is why in anti-defection law, you can only question the decision of the speaker after the decision has been made, not before that. And the court can't get into the procedure taken up by the speaker for anti-defection law. You can only question the outcome of that anti-defection law decision. Similarly, 104 and 194 give immunity to MPs and MLAs for anything that they say and how they vote on the floor of the House. And this is an immunity from the judicial system, a civil and a criminal immunity. We've discussed privileges before. And Article 361 gives the president and the governor some form of immunity and are not accountable to anybody for any action that they take in their professional capacity. हमने ये Article 14 में भी पढ़ा था. And of course, Supreme Court and High Court judges are immune from a scrutiny of their conduct in the Parliament or the legislatures under 121 and 211. The only time you can look at the conduct of a judge is when you are actually impeaching. Otherwise, you can't sit and talk about things. Now, ये complicated क्यों हो जाता है? Because if you can't discuss the conduct of a judge unless you're removing the judge, then the matter ends. But if you are also protected from what you say on the floor of the House. So, for example, when Mahua Mitra gives a speech questioning the judiciary some time ago, but she was protected by immunity, but she was also questioning the judiciary unless you were discussing the conduct of a judge upon impeachment. So two negatives happen and they cancel each other out. And if you read the contents of her speech very carefully, she never spoke against a specific judge directly, but the larger institutional mechanism of the same, right? So this is something which is there as far as autonomy and independence is concerned. Then comes, is that really the case? Is there somewhere that in a parliamentary system, L is going to E is going to L? There are actually several reasons. First, for example, with respect to overlapping personnel, right? अब वो overlapping personnel में कैसे होता है कि भाई at the first, ministers are also MPs, right? The president is also a part of the parliament, not a member of the parliament, but a part of the parliament. So calling a house to session, proroguing a session, dissolving a house, ordinances, emergency, ये सब काम तो कर रहे हो ना एक दूसरे के. So that's of course an issue. Similarly, you will see powers which get often overlapped in terms of between the two organs. So the power of the executive is coextensive to that of the legislature. मतलब सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट उसी चीज़ पे ऑर्डर बना सकती है, उसी चीज़ पे स्कीम बना सकती है जिस पे पार्लियामेंट को कानून बनाने की इजाज़त है, where the parliament has the powers to make laws on, right? Similarly, like the central government, for example, cannot make a right to health kind of a scheme because health is in the state list. Similarly, you will notice that the exercise of ordinances when the houses are not in session, it is when the executive is basically performing a law-making power, which is why ordinances are an application of separation of powers. पार्लियामेंट नहीं थी तो उसके पीछे आप कानून बना रहे हो. कौन कानून बना रहा है? प्रेसिडेंट. किसके एडवाइस पे? काउंसिल ऑफ मिनिस्टर्स के एडवाइस पे. The executive is effectively making a law in the absence of the parliament, right? Similarly, you require some presidential assents also. Under Articles 111, also legislative functions during the state emergency. अब जैसे president जब हाँ ना बोलता है, president तो is the head of the executive, ठीक है? और वो हाँ ना बोलता है, रिटर्न करता है किसी बिल को, तो कहीं ना कहीं they're performing a legislative function, right? The president is the final speed breaker on the legislation. And secondly, when you impose state emergency under 356, and we'll do this in center-state relations eventually, tomorrow perhaps, you will understand that at the end of the day, when a state is under state emergency, the president can actually authorize to make laws on the state list. तो प्रेसिडेंट परफॉर्म तो कर रहे हैं लेजिस्लेटिव ड्यूटीज. एंड द इंटायर कॉन्सेप्ट ऑफ डेलीगेटेड लेजिस्लेशन, जिसमें आप रूल्स ऑर्डर्स बनाते हो, मैंने आपको बताया था, रूल्स आर नॉट टू बी पास्ड बाय द पार्लियामेंट, बट द लॉ गिव्स द पावर टू द एग्जीक्यूटिव टू मेक रूल्स, RTE rules, motor vehicle rules, all of those. This is also an overlapping power. And at the end of the day, the Council of Ministers are collectively responsible to the Lok Sabha. तो कहीं ना कहीं overlap तो है, which is why there is of course a fusion and hopefully not a friction. ऐसा एग्जाम में टक 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 एग्जाम्पल लिखेगा, full marks मिलेगा. And then there are also overlapping powers between the executive and the judiciary. When the president is performing judicial functions such as pardon, reprieve, respite, remiss, commutation, right? The president also resolves disputes with respect to the ages of judges अगर किसी को issue हो तो. We'll do this in judiciary later on. Also the judiciary performs executive functions. जैसे the high courts are administrative heads of all the lower courts. कंटेम्प्ट कोर्ट के पावर्स भी लोअर कोर्ट्स के उस स्टेट के हाई कोर्ट के पास ही होते हैं, राइट? एंड सिमिलरली दे ऑल्सो परफॉर्म एडिशनल ड्यूटीज़ की कौन सा केस कहाँ ट्रांसफ़र होगा, किसके पास आएगा, किस कोर्ट में जाएगा, ये सब कुछ कोर्ट्स ही तो डिसाइड करते हैं. And a lot of times there is an overlapping function between the legislature and the judiciary. Like for example, it is the parliament who decides क्या तूने breach of privilege किया या तूने breach of privilege नहीं किया, तूने vandalism किया, destruction of property किया. The parliament has the powers to send somebody to jail, to punish for contempt, to punish for breach of privilege, to impose a fine. Judicial function है, parliament कर रहा है. And similarly, judiciary also does the same legislative functions. जब आप अपने सुप्रीम कोर्ट रूल बनाते हो, सुप्रीम कोर्ट प्रोसीजर्स बनाते हो, ये कैसे बनाते हो? ये ऐसे बनाते हो बिकॉज यू हैव द पावर्स टू मेक योर ओन इंटरनल प्रोसीजर्स, राइट। अब देखो इसके लिए हम लोगों को इतनी मेहनत करके ये पढ़ना पड़ता है, विच इज़ नथिंग बट सुप्रीम कोर्ट गाइडलाइंस एंड डायरेक्शंस कि सुप्रीम कोर्ट में केस फाइल करना है तो क्या प्रोसीजर फाइल करना है, क्या प्रोसीजर हमें इम्प्लीमेंट करना है, बिकॉज वी नीड टू बी, बिकॉज द सुप्रीम कोर्ट हैज़ द पावर्स टू मेक इट्स ओन रूल्स, इट्स ओन प्रोसीजर्स इन इट्स ओन मैनर। ठीक है, समझ में आया? क्लियर ऑन दिस? सो दिस इज योर लार्जर इकोसिस्टम, दिस इज हाउ इट वर्क्स। ठीक है, अब चेक्स एंड बैलेंसेस समझ लेते हैं। सी व्हेन वी अंडरस्टैंड चेक्स एंड बैलेंसेस, अगर अलग अलग हैं so they can keep a check on each other. So for example, the parliament can impeach the president, start an impeachment process, checks on his activities. The parliament and the president collectively have the powers to remove the judges of the Supreme Court, and of course the president further possesses the power to appoint the judges, of course, of the Supreme Court and the High Court. More importantly, judicial review. अब जुडिशियल रिव्यू सबसे बड़ा क्या है कि सुप्रीम कोर्ट एंड हाई कोर्ट कैन रिव्यू अ लॉ पास्ड बाय द लेजिस्लेचर्स सो दैट द लॉ इज नॉट कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनली ऑब्जेक्शनेबल। उसके लिए आप सुप्रीम कोर्ट में भी जा सकते हो, आप हाई कोर्ट में भी जा सकते हो, विच इज वाई द कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल वैलिडिटी ऑफ अ लॉ कैन बी चैलेंज्ड बोथ एट द सुप्रीम कोर्ट एंड द हाई कोर्ट। यस अनिरुद्ध, ठीक है। सो दिस इज हाउ इट वर्क्स, राइट। अब हमारा जुडिशरी क्या बोलता है? इन राम जमाया कपूर द सुप्रीम कोर्ट वेरी क्लियरली सेज कि भाई कि सेपरेशन ऑफ पावर्स इंडिया के कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन में कहीं नहीं लिखा है। हाउएवर it's the structure clearly differentiates and stops from presumption of powers. In the reference Delhi Laws Act case, the Supreme Court also highlighted कि भाई the British Parliament system was adopted in India, which entails the responsibility of the executive to the legislature as its essential feature and does not strictly follow the doctrine. हाँ, हमें करना चाहिए बट एकदम आग बंद करके नहीं, बिकॉज यूर पार्लियामेंट्री सिस्टम। एंड इंदिरा गांधी वर्सेस राज नारायण, दिस इज the famous emergency case, right? This is where a rigid separation of powers has been given under American and Australian constitutions. India में यहाँ नहीं लगता है. So therefore, no doubt, separation of power is a part of basic structure. So the schemes of the constitution cannot be changed even after, restoring Article 368, which is the power of the parliament to amend the constitution. And of course, उसमें basically क्या हुआ था, that her validity to the elections was challenged. इलाहाबाद हाई कोर्ट ने उसको डिनाई कर दिया था, कहा था कि आप इलेक्शन हार गए हैं, आपका इलेक्शन वैलिड नहीं है, आपने गवर्नमेंट मशीनरी इस्तेमाल करा था। केस वेंट ऑन अपील। दिस बिकेम अ लार्जर इशू ऑफ सेपरेशन ऑफ पावर्स कि हाउ कैन द जुडिशरी डिसाइड वेदर प्राइम मिनिस्टर is worthy enough to have won an election in the right manner or not. And of course, in Golaknath, again extensions to Kesavananda Bharti, all organs must function within the spheres allocated to them, which is that don't violate laws this is also an issue whether the judiciary could look into questioning of laws. The Golaknath case said, of course we can look into everything, and the parliament cannot make a law which violates a fundamental right, which was later on partially changed by Kesavananda Bharti in 1973. I've covered this with almost all batches across the board. ठीक है। अब सेपरेशन ऑफ पावर्स का प्रॉब्लम क्या है? सेपरेशन ऑफ पावर्स का बहुत सिंपल प्रॉब्लम है। सेपरेशन ऑफ पावर्स का प्रॉब्लम बॉस ये है दैट इट इज़ वेरी डिफिकल्ट टू वेरी प्रिसाइसली से लेजिस्लेचर का इतना काम, एग्जीक्यूटिव का इतना काम, जुडिशरी का इतना काम। ठीक है। A smooth and a stable government can only exist if there is cooperation between the three governments. Any attempt which is made to separate these governments into watertight compartments will often lead to inefficiency. And India, while has adopted this concept, but it has not done so in totality. Because if you do that, then it will be very difficult to work together. Because if the legislature cannot delegate technicality of lawmaking to the executive, who may have expertise in the matter of the law, and if the courts can't get into the functioning of court proceedings, then how will anybody know what is the best form of going about it? कोर्ट्स को ही तो पता है ना कोर्ट के प्रोसीजर कैसे बनाएंगे। आपने बोल तो दिया राइट टू एजुकेशन एक्ट, लेकिन एग्जीक्यूटिव बैठ के देखेगा ना कि भाई स्टूडेंट रेशियो क्या होना चाहिए, एजुकेशन आउटकम्स क्या होने चाहिए। उसके लिए आप कहाँ लॉ में खिलते रहोगे। इससे अच्छा ये रहेगा कि आप अपने रूल्स को अमेंड कर दो। right? And we must understand that in the present scenario, a state works for the welfare and the prosperity of the people. It has to resolve these complex issues of society in such circumstances that the principle of separation of powers seems to be impossible. And the imposition of this doctrine in its rigid conception will not lead to the effectuation of the objectives of the modern state. इसका मतलब ये है कि आपका जो strict separation है वो नहीं हो पाएगा अगर आपका objective welfareism है. If you want welfareism to function, then all the branches have to work together, because violation of a right is violation of welfare. Implementation of a right is availability of welfare, and formulation of a law is also enactment of welfare. That is why they must have to work together. And that is why when Montesquieu had said that he wanted to protect people from arbitrariness, it does not mean that this arbitrariness can be protected entirely by a rigid separation. Separation होगा तो एक दूसरे पे चेक ही नहीं कर पाओगे. And that is why separation of powers does not exist in isolation with checks and balances. और ये सुंदर सा conclusion लिखना है अपने आंसर्स में. और conclusion में क्या लिखना है? conclusion में ये डायग्राम बनाना है छोटा सा. ये लेजिस्लेटिव पावर, एग्जीक्यूटिव पावर, जुडिशियल पावर, कोर पावर ज़्यादा रखो, और कहीं ना कहीं ये छोटी छोटी पावर्स ओवरलैप कर जाती हैं अपॉइंटमेंट रिमूवल टाइप. Administrative powers, everybody can do their own thing, and core powers should be kept as separate from each other. And that is why in the post-LPG era, it is very important that separation of powers should be used as a positive and not as a restraint mechanism for cooperation and conflict. अब मेंस में थ्योरी क्वेश्चन आए, प्री में अगर वो छोटा छोटा सा कुछ ऑब्जेक्टिव पूछ ले, बस इतने में ही पढ़ के जाना है, इतना ही पढ़ के जाना है, और यहीं से मार्क्स आएंगे. Are we clear with this? Do we understand this? Is this fine? Is this all right? Yes or no? No or yes? ठीक है. ऑर्डिनेंसेस हम कर चुके हैं. ट्राइब्यूनल्स वी विल नाउ स्टार्ट विद. और ट्राइब्यूनल से पहले थोड़ा सा जुडिशियल रिव्यू, जुडिशियल एक्टिविज्म भी देख लेंगे, बट लेट्स लुक एट ट्राइब्यूनल्स फर्स्ट. And why is tribunals a separation of powers issue? थैंक यू बेटा. ऑलवेज रिमेंबर दिस, क्लासेस खत्म होगी, लाइफ लॉन्ग जब तक मेरी ज़रूरत है, आई एम ऑलवेज हियर. ठीक है, ऑलवेज हियर. नीलेश पूछ रहे इतने से मीन्स हो जाएगा. अरे थियोरेटिकल क्वेश्चन सेपरेशन ऑफ पावर्स का इतने से हो जाएगा. ऑर्डिनेंस हम कवर कर चुके हैं, ट्राइब्यूनल्स हम अभी कवर करेंगे, जुडिशियल रिव्यू एक्टिविज्म हम अभी कवर करेंगे, बस. ठीक है, चलो टेक अ 2 मिनट ब्रेक, क्विकली फ्रेशन अप अ बिट. ट्राइब्यूनल्स करेंगे. ट्राइब्यूनल्स में इतना बता के आपको 2 मिनट का ब्रेक दूंगा कि ट्राइब्यूनल्स का हम जितना ड्रामा बनाते हैं, इट्स एक्चुअली नथिंग बट ए मिड पॉइंट between executive and judiciary. A tribunal is nothing but a court where your judges are judges and bureaucrats. Tribunals are nothing but courts where your judges are judges and civil servants. बस. तो एग्जीक्यूटिव बोलता है कि हमारे पास ज़्यादा पावर होनी चाहिए क्योंकि हमारे बंदे हैं. जुडिशरी बोलता है अरे फंक्शन तो जुडिशल है तो पावर्स हम डिसाइड करेंगे ट्राइब्यूनल की. एग्जीक्यूटिव बोलता है कि हम करेंगे, जुडिशरी बोलता है कि हम करेंगे. विच इज़ वाई लेडीज एंड जेंटलमैन, बॉयज एंड गर्ल्स, ट्राइब्यूनल्स हैज नथिंग टू डू विद जुडिशियल पावर्स. इट इज़ इन फैक्ट एन इशू ऑफ सेपरेशन ऑफ पावर्स. सुओ मोटो एक्शन मतलब तुम्हारे पास वैसी कोई पावर नहीं है तो एक्शन लेके क्या करोगे? ठीक है, सो टेक 2-3 minutes ऑफ, वॉश अप योर फेस, विल स्टार्ट विद ट्राइब्यूनल्स इन जस्ट अबाउट 2 minutes. पक्का अवनीश? चलिए, लेट्स स्टार्ट. सो फर्स्ट थिंग्स फर्स्ट, भाई ट्राइब्यूनल क्या है? Tribunals are nothing but institutions for discharging judicial or quasi-judicial functions with the primary objective that your courts are not specialized and they are overburdened already. क्यों हम इसके बात कर रहे हैं? बिकॉज द सुप्रीम कोर्ट हैज ऑलवेज सेड that because they're performing judicial functions, they should be given the same level of independence of judiciary as any other court, whereas the government thinks that no boss, because we are the ones creating it, we are the ones that are setting it up, we are the ones who are funding it, and we have bureaucrats who are going to also be sitting with judges, then in such a scenario we should decide what their power should be, we should decide how they're going to function, right? So that is why mode of selection, composition, these have always been conflicts, right? That is why the Supreme Court very recently has said that boss, as far as administration is concerned, as far as the conduct of these tribunals are concerned, you can set up it directly under the law ministry because these are legal functions, whereas the government says no. If it's a corporate law tribunal, the Ministry of Corporate Affairs should be the one who should be regulating the tribunal because we need it more than you do. Later, of course, the court in subsequent judgments has said, na tumhara na mera, let's set up an independent tribunal commission, which was in the news all through last year, which is why it becomes extremely important for the coming year also, that we should have a separate body for appointment of tribunal members. None of this has been implemented because this is now far too much of an issue than it should have been, right? अब tribunals क्यों चाहिए? 4 बहुत basic reasons हैं. First, pendency, caseload. Second, to have faster decisions by experts, and a lot of our judges are also not expertised in law. Law is very upcoming. Sports law, intellectual property law, environment law, copyright law. There is so much that is going on, and our judges are also, like our bureaucrats, generalists in nature. So you would require specialists who could therefore be trained in their subject matter. And tribunals, no doubt, were not a part of the original text, were in fact added to the constitution around the same emergency time under 323A and 323B. 323A only refers to administrative tribunals. 323B refers to any other kind of a tribunal. I'm going to give you a comparative review of the same, so don't worry about it. But that's the larger idea. So this is the origin of tribunals is owed to the emergency, where the government also wanted to get some judicial functions on their side, thereby a larger question on separation of powers. So what is the basic difference between a regular court and a tribunal? See, on one hand, a regular court is a part of a formal and an institutional judicial system, whereas a tribunal, on the other hand, is a proper agency which is being set up by a law. There will be an act. Like, for example, in 2021, you abolished a lot of tribunals, including the Censor Tribunal, through the Censorship Act. The second point is, a court of law will have a civil court will have proper judicial powers to try all kinds of a civil nature, unless, of course, you have been prevented from doing so. Whereas tribunals are mostly quasi-judicial bodies and they are for a specific nature. Property का केस होगा तो सिविल कोर्ट में जा सकते हो, लेकिन अगर पैसा रिकवरी का प्रॉब्लम है तो डेट रिकवरी ट्राइब्यूनल में जाना पड़ेगा, राइट? एंड दैट इज व्हाई कोर्ट्स ऑफ लॉ आर जनरलिस्ट्स and tribunals are usually specialists in nature. And the judges, the third point is, the judges of court of law are usually independent of the executive. The judges of ordinary courts have been recruited separately, especially the higher judges or the higher judiciary judges. But in tribunals, that's actually not the case, because the conditions, the term, tenure, appointment, removal are entirely by a law which is made by the executive. And the Chief Justice of a court in a regular court is always a judge, but whereas in a tribunal that may not necessarily be the case. And therefore, a judge in an ordinary court will be relatively more impartial, whereas in a judge in an administrative tribunal, for example, may be a civil servant, and a civil servant will, of course, have a conflicting ideology, will not look at it from a completely neutral standpoint, as far as the ecosystem is concerned, right? Now, a judge of a court of law must always be impartial, and that is something that should be true for tribunals, but it does not always happen. And then when we look at the second last point, you will understand that as far as a regular court is concerned, you will often see that a regular court is extremely procedural. Affidavit, rejoinder affidavit, counter affidavit, ये सब कुछ ड्रामा करना पड़ता है हम लोगों को, right? But in a tribunal, it is usually more relaxed. Procedures are more simplified. You are directed towards a more simplified and a faster resolution process. How much of this actually happens on ground or not is a completely different story, but ऐसा ज़रूर है. And as far as a regular court is concerned, a regular court must decide on all questions objectively. कि भाई ये हमारी कानून है, ये हमारी पॉलिसी है, ये हमारा लॉ है, इसको हम इम्प्लीमेंट करेंगे. Whereas tribunals can look at the overall departmental policy कि भाई हम माना कि अटेम्प्ट एक्स्ट्रा देना चाहिए, बट वो एक्स्ट्रा अटेम्प्ट गवर्नमेंट के पॉलिसी वैकेंसीज पर डिपेंड करता है, विच इज़ वाई इट बिकम्स अ स्लाइटली डिफरेंशिएटिंग प्रोसेस. ये एग्जाम में प्री में पूछ सकते हैं, मेंस में नहीं पूछेंगे बिकॉज ये थोड़ा सा बेसिक है, but you should definitely know the differences. Because of this, you will be able to solve prelims questions on tribunals as well, right? उसके बाद let's look at the constitutional provisions. देखो, depending on the nature of the tribunal, some cases can on appeal go to the High Court, some cases on appeal can go to the Supreme Court. ठीक है. Now there are two constitutional provisions which were inserted in the Constitution through the 42nd Amendment 1976, 323A and 323B. As I was telling you, 323A primarily deals only and only with administrative tribunals, whereas 323B deals with every other kind of tribunal. So if we look at the features of 323 clearly, we can understand that a tribunal under 323A can only be set up by the Parliament, and there would be one for each state and one for, of course, the center. Right? This is extremely important for you to know. Right? तो मतलब एक state या दो state के लिए एक होगा या फिर center के लिए एक. जैसे for example, we have the Central Administrative Tribunal here in New Delhi, where a lot of these cases are filed. आप लोगों के cases, All India Services के cases यहाँ आते हैं. For example, आपका कार्डर ट्रांसफर रुक गया या आपका इंटर कार्डर डेप्यूटेशन नहीं हो रहा है, फिर आप मेरे को 10 साल बाद फ़ोन करते हो कि सर ये क्या है, कोर्ट जाना पड़ेगा, फिर मेरे को कोर्ट जाना पड़ता है. ठीक है. On the other hand, there is something called Article 323B. Now, what is Article 323B? Article 323B deals with any other form of tribunal, whether it is National Green Tribunal or Customs Excise or Securities Appellate. Now, a lot of these are being merged, and most of them have been merged. And these tribunals can usually be in the areas of taxation, foreign exchange, industry, land, urban property. You can have election tribunals also, जो हमने कभी बनाई नहीं. You have rent and tenancy tribunals also. These are the kind of tribunals you can make, as opposed to the tribunals you actually have made. There are, of course, two differences. Now, these kind of tribunals, because they can be in center and state lists or concurrent also, can be made by the center as well as the Parliament. And in 2010, the Supreme Court very clearly clarified, this judgment is not needed, but it very clearly clarified that 323B is not exclusive. You can add any other subject matter which is in the concurrent list, as I just mentioned. And of course, there can be a hierarchy of tribunals. जैसे क्या होता है, competition tribunal, competition appellate tribunal, income tax tribunal, income tax appellate tribunal. ठीक है. ये आप सिस्टम बना सकते हो कि अपीलेट ट्राइब्यूनल फिर अपील में सुप्रीम कोर्ट जा सकता है. ठीक है. जरूरी नहीं है हायरार्की बनाना, बट अगर चाहो बनाना हायरार्की तो हायरार्की बना सकते हो. देयर इज एब्सोल्युटली नो प्रॉब्लम व्हाटसोएवर in that entire process, in that entire ecosystem. ठीक है. What are the basic advantages and disadvantages? See, the advantages are very simple. It is flexible, it is faster, it is cheaper, or at least it is supposed to be cheaper. It is supposed to be cheaper. Procedure is simpler, and of course gives relief to the ordinary rule or court of law. Whereas a disadvantage is आप ऐसे एकदम फास्ट फूड टाइप जस्टिस कर रहे हो, and You must understand that proper courts have a uniform procedure, but हर tribunal का अपना procedure है, अपना method है. As a result, you can often question principles of natural justice. And because these are often led by subject matter experts who are usually retired bureaucrats, what ends up happening is एक court चलाने की एक तरीका होता है, एक तहजीब होती है, right? You have to be judicially trained to run a court proceeding, right? माना कि आप ब्यूरोक्रेट हो, आपने दुनिया देखी, आपको सब आता है, बट एट द एंड ऑफ द डे यू मस्ट ऑल्सो अंडरस्टैंड रनिंग अ कोर्ट इज अ कंप्लीटली डिफरेंट सेटअप. उसमें प्रिंसिपल्स अलग होते हैं, एडमिनिस्ट्रेटिव इश्यूज अलग होते हैं, राइट? नाउ what are the primary problems that we often see with tribunals? Then I'll run you through the judgment also. See, the primary tribunals that we often the primary issues or the primary problems that we often see with tribunals are, first is with respect to the independence of tribunals. देखो प्रॉब्लम क्या है कि माना कि ट्राइब्यूनल है, अब उसमें गवर्नमेंट भी अपनी टांग अड़ाएगी और जुडिशरी भी अपनी टांग अड़ाएगी, तो उससे क्या होगा? उससे there will never be an effective dispute resolution process, which is why the Standing Committee of the Parliament in 2019 had very clearly for the first time recommended the National Tribunals Commission, which the Supreme Court also endorsed eventually, right? और ये कहने की बात है कि tribunals are faster. Tribunals are in fact not faster. If you actually see data, और इस साल का डेटा अभी आया नहीं है, but if you actually see data, the 2021, and there's not going to be a lot of change in 2021 to 2022, that your industrial labor courts, your labor tribunals had more than 7,000 cases. Where armed forces tribunals, where internal cases of armed forces are pending, are about 18,800. Your income tax appellate tribunal, because जनता का income tax का problem है, almost 92,000 cases are pending. And a lot of this is because judges, court staff, court clerks है ही नहीं. If you compare it to the National Company Law Tribunal, बोला था 63 judges होने चाहिए, 63. बोला था 63 judges होने चाहिए, 30 judges हैं. You just have 30 judges, and these judges and these vacancies are extremely concerning, because if most of your people have income tax cases or company resolution cases in the first place, and there are 13,000 such resolutions which are pending before the court. बोला तो आयुष कि आप जा सकते हैं रेगुलर कोर्ट में, right? And the Standing Committee again in 2015 had said that it is the pendency of these cases which is a problem. अब ये कहानी है, इस कहानी को बहुत ध्यान से सुनना. ये कहानी बहुत ज़्यादा इम्पोर्टेंट है, ये कहानी बहुत ज़्यादा रेलिवेंट है, ठीक है? दिस इज लाइक केशवानंदा भारती, ओनली जजमेंट अमेंडमेंट, जजमेंट अमेंडमेंट, जजमेंट अमेंडमेंट. द ओनली डिफरेंस हियर इज देयर इज नो कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल अमेंडमेंट पर से, ठीक है? बहुत ध्यान से देखना. दिस इज समथिंग व्हिच आई हैव एडेड, व्हिच वाज नॉट देयर इन द अर्लियर नोट्स, बिकॉज कुछ 2021 में लेटेस्ट में भी डेवलपमेंट्स हुए थे, ठीक है? The story starts in, इसको थोड़ा सा बड़ा कर देते हैं so that it's easy for everybody to see, है ना? चलो. The story starts in 1941, pre-independence, where India's first ever tribunal gets established. Okay, first ever tribunal. Now, and it's the income tax tribunal. In 1969 and in 1974, ARCs recommended that you should have a civil services tribunal, the first ARC, and in 1974, the sixth ARC recommended that you should have other specialized tribunals. अब इन दोनों recommendations के basis पर, in addition to the recommendations of the Swaran Singh Committee, which also had recommended something in Part 4 and Part 4A, was the 42nd Amendment of 1976 enacted, through which you got 323A and 323B. Right? Now, administrative tribunals, all India appellate tribunals for labor and industry, land revenue tribunals, they were all set up. But they were all set up under the scrutiny of the Supreme Court. By the 1980s, we ended up having the Central Administrative Tribunal, Securities Tribunal, some film tribunals, electricity tribunals, because लोग अपने बिजली के बिल कहाँ भरते हैं? अब लड़ते रहो जाके, उसमें 10 साल लगेंगे, हमारी बिजली काट देंगे वो. So this happened. Now, In 1986, the Supreme Court, in a judgment, because the Parliament started making certain laws on it, in SP Sampath versus Union of India, this is a case where judicial review also comes back into context. The Supreme Court very clearly said the Parliament can create tribunals parallel to courts, but this and these appointments to these tribunals must be done in consultation with the courts. The appointments to these must be done in consultation with the courts. ठीक है, अंडर ऑल सर्कमस्टांसेस. ठीक है, तो असली कहानी जो है वो 1986 से शुरू होती है. ठीक है, एक सेकेंड. हाँ, अरे ओके ना, in 1980 एक थोड़ा इसको इधर ही कर लेते हैं. Right now, we can create tribunals parallel to courts, parallel to high courts in fact, and you can do that by, and your appointments must be in consultation with the Chief Justice of India or the high courts for that matter. ठीक है, अब in 1997 in L Chandra Kumar, ये judicial review के लिए बहुत important case है, because यहाँ somebody is trying to decide who controls the judiciary, and therefore in L Chandra Kumar versus Union of India, the Supreme Court said your high court equivalent tribunals must be treated like high courts. इनका original jurisdiction, which means cases that can be directly filed to these courts, must be supervised by the high court, and you should always give preference to judicial members. यहाँ गवर्नमेंट की थोड़ी सी सटकनी शुरू हो गई, and there should be an independent agency to manage all of this. जब तक आप एक independent agency नहीं बनाते, let the law ministry or any other ministry look into this. Then for 13 years nobody said anything. Then in R. Gandhi versus Union of India in 2010, the Supreme Court said the Parliament can create High Court alternative tribunals on the union list. The judicial members must always have more powers than the technical members. There should always be more judicial members than technical members. और अगर objective is for fast dissolution of cases, तो technical member की जरूरत ही नहीं है, फिर तो हमको law apply करके आगे बढ़ना है. And if you really want to implement technical members और government से उठाने हैं, तो secretary level officers को उठाओ, उस experience से उठाओ with technical knowledge so that they can be appointed as members. ठीक है. Now in 2014, in the Madras Bar Association case, the Supreme Court held कि बॉस ऐसा क्यों है, हम एक काम करते हैं कि हम इंडियन कॉर्पोरेट लॉ सर्विस और इंडियन लॉ सर्विस वाले लोगों को बिठा देते हैं. तो गवर्नमेंट से सुप्रीम कोर्ट ने कहा नहीं, these members will not be considered as judicial members but as technical members. तो because when the court said ठीक है हम टेक्निकल मेंबर को बिठाओ, तो पार्लियामेंट ने कहा हाँ कॉर्पोरेट लॉ सर्विस हमने बनाई है ना सिविल सर्विसेज में, इन्हीं को बिठाते हैं ट्राइब्यूनल में, तुमको क्या प्रॉब्लम है. कोर्ट ने कहा कॉर्पोरेट लॉ सिविल सर्विस है, जुडिशियल मेंबर मतलब जज. ओके, एंड द मिनिस्ट्री ऑफ लॉ शुड प्रोवाइड एडमिनिस्ट्रेटिव सपोर्ट, और कोई पेरेंट डिपार्टमेंट को कोई टेक्निकल हेल्प चाहिए तो वो कर सकते हैं. फिर गवर्नमेंट ने कहा बस बहुत हो गया. 2017 Finance Act heavily debated. The government said boss, enough is enough. We'll start merging tribunals. So competition tribunal, security tribunal सब उठा के एक में कर दिया कंपनी लॉ ट्राइब्यूनल. 26 ट्राइब्यूनल थे, काट के 19 कर दिए. ठीक है, एंड कहा कि सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट विल हैव द पावर्स टू डिसाइड द कंपोजिशन एंड टेन्योर ऑफ ट्राइब्यूनल्स. दिस गेट्स चैलेंज्ड लेटर अगेन इन द रॉजर मैथ्यूज केस, बिकॉज भाई ये तो वही आधार वाली बात हो गई, ये मनी बिल कैसे हो गया, ये मनी बिल बने चिपका दिया, बिकॉज फाइनेंस एक्ट इज एट द एंड ऑफ द डे अ मनी बिल, इट्स अ पार्ट ऑफ द बजट, राइट. इन 2019 in Roger Matthews versus South Indian Bank, very important case, the Supreme Court said जुडिशियल फंक्शन जुडिशियल मेंबर करेगा. पार्लियामेंट और द एग्जीक्यूटिव कैन नॉट रिमूव द जजेस फ्रॉम द ट्राइब्यूनल. यूनिफॉर्म एज रहेगी, कोई साल 6 महीने 2 साल का टेन्योर नहीं रहेगा. एंड वी विल कंडक्ट जुडिशियल इम्पैक्ट असेसमेंट ऑफ ट्राइब्यूनल्स. Later in 2020, again in the Madras Bar Association case, the Supreme Court said set up a National Tribunals Commission, और उनका 5-year tenure होना चाहिए instead of a 4-year tenure. और 67 years of retirement रखो, so that even retired judges and retired bureaucrats can be a part of this. 2021 government starts shutting down four more a few more tribunals. जैसे तुम्हारा फिल्म सर्टिफिकेट ट्राइब्यूनल बंद करा, ठीक है, और कहा कि नहीं हम तो 50 ही रखेंगे मिनिमम एज, और टेन्योर विल बी 4 years, उसके ऊपर नहीं. हम 5 साल बोल रहे थे, उन्होंने कहा नहीं 4 साल. And then in 2021, the Supreme Court struck down the 4-year tenure and struck down the minimum 50 years age requirement. Because 50 years age requirement अगर होता तो फिर bureaucrats काफ़ी सारे जो थे, if the Supreme Court struck it down ताकि lower judges could also be a part of it. Otherwise ज़्यादा bureaucracy होती, हमारे पास options नहीं रहते, right? So ये पूरा ड्रामा काफ़ी समय तक चलता रहा, ठीक है. Understood this. And this is the act and the details of it कि minimum age वगैरह वगैरह वगैरह, ये सारी चीज़ें मैं आपको ऑलरेडी ब्रॉडली बता चुका हूँ. इससे इशू ये था कि आपने सिनेमा, ट्रेडमार्क, कॉपीराइट, कस्टम, पेटेंट, एयरपोर्ट ट्राइब्यूनल, प्लांट वैरायटी, जोग्राफिकल इंडिकेटर ट्राइब्यूनल, ये सारे बंद कर दिए, ठीक है. कहा मिनिमम 50 एज होना चाहिए, 4 साल होना चाहिए, चेयरपर्सन 70 साल रिटायर हो गए, अदर मेंबर्स 67 पर रिटायर होंगे. ऑब्वियसली दिस इंक्रीजेज द जुडिशियल बर्डन, बिकॉज ट्राइब्यूनल बंद करोगे तो केसेस कोर्ट में जाएंगे. और यहाँ सुप्रीम कोर्ट ने क्लियरली बोला था, बहुत क्लियरली बोला था कि भाई 5 years का मिनिमम का टर्म होना चाहिए और मिनिमम एज 50 years की होनी चाहिए. एंड द प्रॉब्लम इज इट डिस्करेजेज यंग टैलेंट. एडवोकेट्स विद 10 years of experience could therefore become judicial members. मैं भी सोचो जुडिशियल ट्राइब्यूनल का मेंबर बन जाता, कितना सही होता मेरे लिए. इसे दिन भर बैठ के मैं इसे खेलता, ये पिक्चर सही है, ये पिक्चर ख़राब है, बट इन्होंने सिनेमा ट्राइब्यूनल ही बंद कर दिया, राइट. सो दीज आर ऑफ कोर्स इश्यूज. क्या डेवलपमेंट्स हुए हैं, ये टेक्निकल डिटेल्स हैं, ये मैंने यहाँ लिख दी ताकि आपको थोड़ा और डिटेल में समझ में आ जाए. 2017, 2019 ये रूल्स बनाए थे, रूल्स को चैलेंज करा, फिर उन्होंने नए रूल्स बनाए, नए रूल्स चैलेंज करे, फिर उन्होंने 2017 के एक्ट को चैलेंज करा. एंड दैट इज़ हाउ दिस इसेंशली बिकेम योर Roger Matthew case became the most important one, right? Of course this is uploaded in the drive. अनिरुद्ध ऐसी क्या बातें कर रहे हो, मैं तो ड्राइव से ही निकाला है. मेंस फोल्डर, न्यू फोल्डर, सिलेबस .3 अपडेट कर दिया है मैंने अनिरुद्ध, राइट. So does this violate Article 14 and 21 because you're creating inequality of employment? Second, ये money bill कैसे बना दिया? And third, of course, by the restrictions, are you affecting the independence of judiciary? इसके बहुत simple judgments थे, and ये judgment बहुत जगह लगता है. जैसे can the court review the speaker's certification of a money bill? Yes. If yes, was this validly elected? अभी ये लार्जर क्वेश्चन को गया हुआ है, इस पर भी जजमेंट नहीं आया है कि ये मनी बिल सही है या गलत है, ठीक है. अब ऑब्वियसली थर्ड क्वेश्चन इज इफ इट वाज वैलिडली इलेक्टेड देन डिड द लेजिस्लेचर एक्सेसिवली डेलीगेट पावर्स. जब वो अभी मनी बिल पे ही नहीं है तो इस पर भी डिसीजन नहीं है, इस पर नो ही है, ठीक है. इवन इफ इट डज नॉट सफर, ये टेक्निकल पॉइंट है, आप छोड़ सकते हो, विच इज़ नथिंग बट योर इज इट वायलेटिंग योर appellate rules? The answer is no. And fifth, what measure should be taken? Judicial impact assessment होना चाहिए, ठीक है. Apart from this, there are some beautiful suggestions that I think you should write in a tribunal answer. First, it should be financially independent. Second, directly finance ministry को funds allocate करने चाहिए, इस judgment के 104 नंबर पेज में है. दूसरा, एक फाइनेंशियल इम्पैक्ट असेसमेंट कंडक्ट करना चाहिए सो दैट हमें पता हो कि किस ट्राइब्यूनल को कितना पैसा चाहिए. थर्ड, ट्राइब्यूनल्स को शुड नॉट बी गिवन इन इक्वलेंट स्टेटस टू अ सुप्रीम कोर्ट और अ हाई कोर्ट जज, बट इन फैक्ट दे शुड बी ट्रीटेड एज सबऑर्डिनेट्स. दैट इज हाउ अपील्स विल गो टू द सुप्रीम कोर्ट एंड हाई कोर्ट. एंड लेजिस्लेचर शुड कंसल्ट द लॉ कमीशन ताकि हमें समझ में आए कि भाई डायरेक्ट अपील सुप्रीम कोर्ट में मत भेजो, हाई कोर्ट में भेजो ताकि बर्डन कम रहे सुप्रीम कोर्ट का. एंड लास्टली, यू शुड हैव अगर जितना हो सके ट्राइब्यूनल्स को हमें मर्ज करना चाहिए. सरकार इसकी बात मान ली और उन्होंने 2021 में आधे मर्ज करके ख़त्म ही कर दिए, ठीक है. सो दिस इज़ हाउ इट इज़. और नेशनल ट्राइब्यूनल कमीशन क्या है? सबसे पहले एल चंद्र कुमार में बोला था that it should be done through a constitutional amendment and will require administrative support, and therefore you will make sure that neither the legislature nor the judiciary is getting a little too overboard. एक proper company corporatized type structure होना चाहिए, right? Okay. राइट, सिंपल कॉर्पोरेट टाइप स्ट्रक्चर होना चाहिए, उसमें एक सीईओ, एक सेक्रेटेरिएट, परफॉर्मेंस स्टैंडर्ड्स होने चाहिए, एंड दिस कुड फंक्शन एज एन इंडिपेंडेंट रिक्रूटमेंट बॉडी टू डेवलप एंड ऑपरेशनलाइज प्रोसीजर्स. और एडमिनिस्ट्रेटिव रोल्स में हमें वी शुड ट्राई एंड प्रोवाइड ट्रेनिंग, सपोर्ट, लिटिगेशन टू द लॉयर्स, एवरीथिंग जितना हो सके हमें करना चाहिए, सो दैट योर स्टाफ गेट्स बेटर एंड योर ओवरऑल जस्टिस डिलीवरी सिस्टम इज अ बेटर वे. राइट, अब इससे एक और सवाल उठता है कि भाई क्या ट्राइब्यूनल अपने आप से सुओ मोटो, मतलब क्या होता है, ए हैज टू फाइल अ केस अगेंस्ट बी इन द कोर्ट. कभी कभी कोर्ट अपने मन से अपने आप बोलती है कि अच्छा बी को बुला के लाओ, ए पहुंचा ही नहीं है कोर्ट, बी को बुला के लाओ. दैट इज कॉल्ड सुओ मोटो पावर्स. और इसके लिए सबसे ज्यादा इनफेमस है नेशनल ग्रीन ट्राइब्यूनल. लास्ट 2 साल पहले हुआ था एनजीटी, ये अपना विशाखा गैस लीक केस, एलजी पॉलीमर केस. उसमें मीडिया रिपोर्ट्स पे एनजीटी ने केस भी फाइल कर दिया, केस भी टेकअप कर दिया, 50 करोड़ का फाइन भी दे दिया. 2018 में म्यूनिसिपल कॉर्पोरेशन ऑफ बॉम्बे को 5 करोड़ का फाइन दे दिया. 2021 में लास्ट ईयर ऑर्डर पास करा, कहा कि क्वारीज जो है वो 200 मीटर दूर होनी चाहिए रेजिडेंशियल एरिया से. दिस इज डन बाय अ स्टैट्यूटरी ट्रिब्यूनल एक्सरसाइजिंग सुओ मोटो पावर्स. दिस इज अ वेरी कॉम्प्लिकेटेड लीगल क्वेश्चन. हाई कोर्ट, सुप्रीम कोर्ट करे वो कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनली अलाउड है, यहाँ तुमने लॉ में कर दिया है. दिस कैन गो आउट ऑफ प्रपोर्शन इफ इट इज पोलिटिसाइज्ड और इफ इट्स करप्टेड. The problem is statutory tribunal is a quasi-judicial body and does not have the administrative powers, does not have like a proper court, the institutional powers to decide cases on a broad area. उनको सिर्फ एक specific area में काम करने को allow किया है, and they are limited by the law and they are not constitutionally sort of recognized. ठीक है, ये लोग नहीं समझते. ठीक है, understood this? हाँ अवनीश, I'll make an index, don't worry. अरे अनिकेश, बिल्कुल जिसके साथ आपको शेयर करना आप करो यार, पढ़ाई करो. एंड देन ऑफ कोर्स द रैशनल वाज एनजीटी एक्ट में लिखा हुआ है, बाकी भी ट्राइब्यूनल्स करते हैं. ठीक है, नाउ एनजीटी एक्ट जहाँ पे ये होता है वहाँ पे बहुत क्लियरली मेंशन नहीं है दैट एनजीटी हैज सुओ मोटो पावर्स, इन्होंने अपने आप से बना दिया है. कर्नाटका लैंड रिफॉर्म एक्ट ऑल्सो हैज लिमिटेड सुओ मोटो पावर्स, बट वो उसके एक्ट में लिखा हुआ है. एंड डेट रिकवरी ट्राइब्यूनल में तो बहुत क्लियर है कि नहीं है. ठीक है, सो दिस इज वाई इट इज नॉट अ यूनिफॉर्म सेटअप. ठीक है, एंड देन वी मस्ट अंडरस्टैंड भाई नेशनल ग्रीन ट्राइब्यूनल क्या करता है, क्या नहीं करता है. नेशनल ग्रीन ट्राइब्यूनल की बात कर रहे हैं तो सेटअप इन 2010, हैज ज्यूरिसडिक्शन ओवर ऑल सिविल केसेस involving questions with respect to the environment. It is special because India is the only third country in the world after Australia and New Zealand to have a dedicated tribunal, for environment. The principal bench in New Delhi and the regional benches are also there. वो regional benches से फिर आप respective courts में भी अपील में जा सकते हैं. What is the basic problem? जो two most important acts of environment है, Wildlife 1972 and Scheduled and Forest Dwellers Act of 2006, वो एनजीटी देखता ही नहीं है. सेकेंड, एनजीटी का कौन से केस हाई कोर्ट में जाएंगे, कौन से केस सुप्रीम कोर्ट में जाएंगे, किसी को नहीं पता है. तो कुछ केसेस हाई कोर्ट में चले जाते हैं, हाई कोर्ट एक्सेप्ट कर लेता है, कुछ में सुप्रीम कोर्ट चले जाते हैं. नाउ द प्रॉब्लम इज द नेशनल ग्रीन ट्राइब्यूनल डिसीजंस आर ऑफन नॉट कंप्लाइड विद एंटायरली. अ फ्यू डेज अगो देयर वाज एन इंडियन एक्सप्रेस इन्वेस्टिगेशन जहाँ पे उन्होंने बताया था मेगा पावर्स वर ऑफ कोर्स मेगा प्रोजेक्ट्स वर not conforming to Supreme Court directions, and the lack of human and financial resources has led to a high pendency of cases which undermines NGT's very objective of disposal of appeals within 6 months. ये तो सबसे बड़ी प्रॉब्लम है कि 6 महीने में करना था लेकिन जज और कोई और है ही नहीं. कुछ बेसिक केसेस हैं जैसे बेटी अलवारेस वर्सेस गोवा, इवन अ फॉरेन नेशनल कैन अपील दी एनजीटी. अलमित्रा पटेल एंड यूनियन ऑफ इंडिया कि आप वेस्ट लैंड पे ओपन बर्निंग नहीं कर सकते. मनोज मिश्रा वर्सेस डीडीए कि भाई यमुना, ये जो आपका आर्ट ऑफ लिविंग का जो वो हुआ था फेस्टिवल, उसमें उन्होंने काफ़ी साल हो गए, उस पर उन्होंने यमुना के बैंक्स पे करा था, and it caused so much of damage to the river Yamuna that you could not really even get out of it, you could not really even recover from it. ठीक है. एंड एज फार एज एनजीटी एंड सो मोटो पावर्स आर कंसर्न, लास्ट ईयर की बात है, दिस इज द न्यू डेटा दैट हैव एडेड. म्यूनिसिपल कॉर्पोरेशन ऑफ बॉम्बे वर्सेस अंकिता सिन्हा, सुप्रीम कोर्ट ने एक लाइन में कहा है एनजीटी के पास सुओ मोटो पावर है बिकॉज इट इज प्रोटेक्टिंग अ की राइट ऑफ लाइफ विच इज द राइट टू एनवायरमेंट. However, Section 14 says there must be a civil case. It should concern the environment. It should involve implementation of environmental legislations. अगर ऐसा है तो NGT suo moto केस उठा सकती है. And NGT goes beyond dispute resolution. NGT is responsible for upholding and protecting the environment, which India is so naively trying to handle, right? And as long as the broad area काम कर रहे हैं कोई issue नहीं है. And of course you're guided by principles of environmental justice and equity. ठीक है, तो ये आपके NGT ट्राइब्यूनल्स अच्छे से कवर हो गया. अब हम क्या करेंगे, हम कल फर्स्ट हाफ में 2 घंटे में हम जुडिशरी, जुडिशियल रिव्यू, एक्टिविज्म. नाउ यू अंडरस्टैंड हाउ जुडिशियल रिव्यू एंड एक्टिविज्म इज अ पार्ट ऑफ सेपरेशन ऑफ पावर्स. उसको हम जुडिशरी से लिंक करेंगे. वी विल फिनिश दैट अप. Then we will move to center state relations. Center state में फेडरलिज्म लगेगा थोड़ा सा टाइम. एंड अनलाइक रेस्ट ऑफ आर क्लासेस जहाँ हम लेयर 1 पे लेयर 2 बिल्ड करते थे, हम फेडरलिज्म में लेयर 2 पे लेयर 1 बिल्ड करेंगे बिकॉज लेयर 1 में ज़्यादा कुछ आता नहीं है प्री में. ठीक है, अंडरस्टूड. ऑल राइट, इसके प्रिंटेबल वर्जन्स आर ऑल्सो अवेलेबल ऑन द ड्राइव बाय द वे. ठीक है, थैंक्स आयुष. Can it be questioned before the court of law only on procedure ground? No, on anything also. 2018 question. Sure, Kashapi, I'll discuss the 2018 question also. Tribunals curtail the jurisdiction. In view of the above, discuss the constitutional validity. तो आप इसमें लिखोगे river water disputes come, it's a separate, it's under Article 263. So do you agree with the view, how far do you agree that tribunals curtail the jurisdiction? इसका आंसर ही होगा they do not curtail. You are specializing and reducing the workload of ordinary courts. Constitutional validity 322, 323A, 323B और competency में आपका analysis मिल गया. What are the issues and how do you make tribunals better? No, consumer courts are not tribunals. Very good question though, Akash. No, we'll start judiciary tomorrow and link judicial review and activism accordingly. Difference between appellate tribunal and tribunal is Supreme Court and High Court, lower court, higher court. Ravi, ठीक है. सुबूर कोचिंग तो रहे ना रहे, ड्राइव का एक्सेस जिंदगी भर रहेगा, अपडेट होती रहेगी. ठीक है, बस बेटा इन सबको करने के लिए बहुत मेहनत लगता है यार. Yes, has suo moto powers, but in other matters it NGT only has suo moto powers or environment ना, it's no other court. और कोई केसेस थोड़ा ना करता है, इन्वायरमेंट केसेस ही तो करता है. Yes, Twarit, I will let you know. ठीक है. Civil ordinances can be retrospective because civil laws can be retrospective because they are coextensive with the parliament. Can the parliament make a civil law on a back date? Yes. No, Mansi. Only any law कहाँ से हो गया? अरे टेलीकॉम डिस्प्यूट, टीडी सैट इज टेलीकॉम डिस्प्यूट्स राइट. हाँ हाँ ट्राइब्यूनल है भाई. प्रिंटेबल वर्जन इज फॉर ऑल. आई विल चेक अगेन. हाँ पंकज, बिकॉज प्रिविलेज एंड पावर आफ्टर अ पॉइंट ऑफ टाइम बिकम पॉइंटलेस. मतलब हाँ, सुओ मोटो मतलब किसी को केस फाइल करने की जरूरत नहीं है. आप कोर्ट अपने आप ही केस ले सकता है. ठीक है, अखबार पढ़ के हम सुओ मोटो करेंगे जुडिशरी में और ढंग से, तभी आपको और समझ में आएगा. Why political doesn't? They can if they want to, but they don't. Because representation है ना. नवीन मेरे को कर दो यार मेल. आदित्य सच इज दिल्ली. Governance notes also and governance classes also I'll provide. Don't worry. ठीक है, डन. इतना भी सिंप्लीफाई मत करो यार हिमांशु. तो कल सैटरडे है, कल हमें करना है फेडरलिज्म, कल हमें करना है जुडिशरी और सेंटर स्टेट फेडरलिज्म, और परसों हम करेंगे बॉडीज और खत्म हो जाएगा. यस, भावना में देखता हूं. मैं भी नवीन देखता हूँ. I'll just check. ये मेरा नंबर है, किसी ने मेरा नंबर मांगा था भाई. अंकित, एक तो बॉटम मंथ आ गई अंकित, आप पूछ रहे थे उस दिन. एंड सारे गवर्नेंस क्लासेस मैं यूट्यूब पे डाल दूंगा. हाँ हाँ, मंडे में कोचिंग आएंगी, बिल्कुल आएंगे. पॉलिटी खत्म करके टशन में आएंगे. ओके. हाँ ऋतिक, बिकॉज आई क्लोज द फॉर्म. यस नीलेश. ओके, डन. See you. Bye bye.